On July 11, 1960, Moise Tshombe declared the Congolese province of Katanga an independent state with himself serving as its new president. The first wave of United Nations peacekeepers would begin appearing less than 4 days later, which would serve as the catalyst to a crisis lasting for over 5 years. By the following winter, the scene could be described as filthy duty for all concerned, amid the mortar-shattered capital of Elizabethville with its jacaranda-shaded broad boulevards that still bore European names like Astrid and Stanley. The savage little war was exploding all around. With Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld killed in a plane crash en route to attempt peace negotiations between Tshombe's secessionist group and the Congo proper, all concerned parties were on edge. The Gurkha troops believed that local Baluba tribesmen were cannibalizing their dead. The Katangis accused UN fighter bombers of napalming innocent civilians, and both sides were thirsty. The Simba brewery had been knocked out of action and would stand unrepaired for quite some time. In a stripped-down high-rise room in Leopoldville, capital of the Congo, under the watchful eyes of armed guards, sat a man whose expensive suit now hung soiled upon his body. Accused of trying to smuggle weapons to Tshombe's forces, UN Blue Helmets arrested him at the Elizabethville airport and transported him away for interrogation. This man, whose exploits not many could parallel, would find none of the comforts he had grown accustomed to over the many years of traveling in high-class circles. Hubert Julian, known the world over as the Black Eagle of Harlem, had finally gotten his wings clipped. He had been in trouble many times before, yet this man, who had become famous as a parachutist, an aviator, a soldier of fortune, and in his current occupation as an arms dealer, had always seemed to be able to talk his way out of a jam. This time, however, there would be nothing he could do. It would be his jailers who would tell him when they were done with him. It would be his jailers who would dictate his daily routine. And it would be his jailers who would ultimately keep him locked up for 4 months.
4 months in which I had plenty of time to reflect on all the events and excitements which had finally led me to imprisonment here in the center of the continent from which my forefathers had been taken so long ago. This, I was determined, would be my last adventure. The clock was ticking a little slower now, and as I surveyed the 65 years of my life, I made up my mind. It was time for this adventurer to retire.
It was recorded by J. Wilkinson, the British Registrar of the Colony of Trinidad, that on September 20th, 1897, within the white frame house at 21 Charlotte Street in Port of Spain, Hubert Fauntleroy was born to Henry Julian, a manager at a cocoa plantation, and his wife Lily. Most of Julian's early years are shrouded in both mystery and misinformation. He himself would tell later in life of his family being very wealthy, yet there is no proof that they were anything beyond what might today be considered as lower middle class. While not poor, they were not as well off as he would have liked people to have believed. And whether or not his father wanted him to become a doctor so badly that he would send him away to England as a teenager becomes a moot point, as there is simply no evidence to back this up. This habit of stretching the truth was a trademark of Julian's. Yet when one digs deep enough, they can find the honesty in between the tall tales.
The Trinidadian author V.S. Naipaul writes in the very first sentence of A Bend in the River, "The world is what it is. Men who are nothing, who allow themselves to become nothing, have no place in it." And I always thought that really applied to Julian as well, because he's a guy from this out-of-the-way place with not much compelling history. So he needs to create his own history, create his place in the world, make himself into something important. I don't know if I'm projecting that onto Julian, but I feel like that's what he's doing, is he's making his place in the world because it hasn't been made for him.
Mine was a very happy childhood in Trinidad. The sun really did shine all the time. There was plenty to do, plenty to eat, and friends to play with. Like all West Indians, cricket was my game. And before I was 10, my parents had given me bat, ball, and stumps, and soon We had a team from our neighborhood which used to play other lads on scratch wickets marked out in the park facing our house.
Julian's education began at the Eastern Boys Primary School. In 1910, he would advance into St. Mary's College, a government-assisted secondary school with a Roman Catholic affiliation, located in the heart of Port of Spain. Because there are no preserved records from this time period, it is not known what type of student he was. What is clear, however, is when and how Julian's future life truly took root. Just 5 years after the Wright brothers had made history in 1903 by being the first to pilot a powered flight, the Boland brothers of Rahway, New Jersey, consisting of Joseph, Frank, and James, had managed to design, build, and test an 8-cylinder water-cooled engine.
Early aircraft, really into the 1920s, they were all wood. They were covered with fabric. They had wooden propellers, lightly built, few metal fittings. Aircraft were prone to structural failure at the time, very underpowered. They can stall, spin, and turn, and really took a fair amount of skill to keep one in the air.
The key to their airplane's successful ease of handling and maneuverability was a patented system of lateral control, long known to sailors as a jib. Wilbur Wright himself, after checking to make sure his and Orville's patents were not being infringed upon, praised the work of the Bolands.
Frank Boland long ago became interested in aviation problems and gave up an automobile business to devote his time to the development of a flying machine of his own invention. He dispensed with the conventional rudder in his biplane, relying upon speed and his ability to shift his weight from one position to another to steer the craft. In 1911, he had frequent narrow escapes from death, but each mishap appeared to make him more determined to succeed in perfecting his machine. The Montreal Gazette.
The brothers set out in 1912 to tour South America and the West Indies with their tailless biplane, performing exhibitions for crowds of more than curious onlookers who had never even seen a picture of an airplane, let alone one in the flesh. After accomplishing numerous flights in Venezuela, Frank scheduled one in Trinidad for January 23, 1913, which would serve to be the island's first in its history.
We stood eagerly around the field as the airman, dressed in breeches, high boots, and leather jacket, made last-minute adjustments to his plane. Then he climbed in. The mechanic swung the propeller, and the engine burst into life. As the pilot opened the throttle, there was a crescendo of noise. Then the plane rolled forward and soared into the air. It circled the field twice, with every head in the crowd white, black, swiveling to follow its progress. Suddenly, with no warning, the engine cut out and the plane plunged to the ground just outside the field where thousands upon thousands of people were watching.
Frank Boland, age 32, was pulled from the wreckage of his shattered cockpit, dead upon impact. Julian burst into tears upon seeing the mangled corpse of the aviator he had only minutes before watched climb into the air in a most triumphant manner. He was horrified that such an effortless and gracefully appearing act could end so abruptly and tragically. The day Frank Boland died was the day a spark was lit inside of Hubert Julian, who, in his own mind, would pick up and carry on the torch where aviation and aeronautical innovation were concerned.
From that day onwards, all my interest was in flying. I made up my mind to be one of this race of birdmen myself, and I was also determined that somehow, someday, I would find a way to stop planes and men falling helplessly from the sky. Books on aviation and engineering became to me what comics and storybooks were to other boys. For years, I kept the Trinidad Gazette containing the account of that crash, and each day I would search the current paper eagerly for any stories of new flights. I used to bore my friends with facts and figures about aeroplanes, with my own theories and with my predictions for the future. It was almost an obsession with me.
When World War I broke out in July 1914, the colonies of the British Empire saw themselves thrust into the conflict. The residents of the Caribbean islands, under the rule of the Crown, would now be expected to take up arms against an enemy thousands of miles away on a continent completely foreign to them. Julian, who would be just 17 years old at the time, but now a high school graduate, might have felt that joining in the fight against the Central Powers was his duty as a citizen of the United Kingdom. In reality, it also might have been his way of eventually gaining access to an airplane, which would see its debut as a fighting machine now with the war going on. Resolved, Julian left his parents' home one morning, walked down to the St. James Barracks, and enlisted in the Trinidad and Tobago unit of the West India Regiment. Even though he was on the cusp of adulthood, Julian, on his walk back home that evening, knew he would have to answer to his mother and father for the decision he had made that day, without either their consent or, at the very least, their blessing.
Very fearfully, I told my mother what I had done. She set up a crying and a wailing as if I had committed suicide. And soon my father and all my aunts and uncles were on the scene. I was a fully grown, strapping 6-footer, but my father gave me the biggest hiding of my life for joining up without first asking his permission. And to my great regret, it was all to no avail. For after 5 weeks of drill and fatigues, I was out of the army. Officially, the reason was that I was medically unfit, but as that was clearly not true, I believe my father, who had some influence in the island, had arranged my discharge.
Henry Julian had to have taken care of getting his son out of the military, as there is no record of association between Hubert Julian and the West India Regiment. So determined was his father that he should not serve, that the enlistment papers were wiped from the books. This instance reflects a truth not normally seen in Julian's own account of his life. If anything, it makes him look weak and cowardly. An emptiness appeared inside the character of this young man when he was not allowed to serve in a regiment that would go on to see action in the Cameroons, East African, and the Sinai and Palestine campaigns. Julian was being shaped by both his boyhood desire to enter into aviation and now a desire to seek fame and glory. Less than 2 years after the November 1918 armistice, Hubert Julian found himself as a passenger aboard the SS Chaudière. With the Great War over, he had arranged to finally leave Trinidad, determined to make something of himself in the world outside of the Caribbean within the profession, as he yearned for, of aviation. To say that Henry Julian was supportive of his son's dreams, however, would be a falsity.
In those early days, my father, like so many other people, regarded aeroplanes as a strange and rather dangerous novelty with little practical potential. He dismissed all my talk of flying as a boyhood craze, but I kept plugging away at the subject, for I was certain that bigger and faster planes would soon be produced, and that in the future it would not be a question of a 15-minute joyride for the thrill of it, but an everyday means of getting from place to place.
The Chaudiere's manifest shows us that Hubert Julian, whose occupation is listed as a mechanic, was documented to be carrying roughly $700 on his person. This shows that during the war and right after, he had entered into a profession he felt would prepare him for passing on into aeronautics. The amount of money he had with him was, more than likely, his entire life's savings. Failure to meet the goals he had been setting for himself over the roughly 8 years since the Boland crash was not an acceptable option. Julian was determined to make a life for himself and show his family back in Port of Spain that he was not simply trying to live out a childish fantasy where no future could exist. So in early March 1920, Hubert Julian stepped off the Chaudière and onto Canadian soil. From his point of disembarkation in St. John, New Brunswick, Julian settled in Montreal. He would have found employment and lodging, but in his free time, Julian would find himself at Cartierville Airport, the country's oldest.
I haunted the airfield and soon got to know many of the pilots there who appreciated my interest in what they were doing and who lent me manuals of instruction and technical books, as well as allowing me to join them in their mess at times.
A lot of aviators at the time, they were viewed kind of as showmen, stuntmen, crackpots, thrill seekers, those really trying to push back the frontier, and those trying to make a few bucks off of this new sport. And something to watch in the movies and in the read about in the newspapers, really not contributing in a great way to society.
Whether or not he was working directly on airplanes is unknown, but what can be firmly cemented is when Hubert Julian's first venture into the skies occurred, November 1920. And the name of the pilot who took him up was Billy Bishop, Canadian flying ace of the First World War.
It was for his attack on the enemy airdrome when he destroyed 3 German planes that Bishop was decorated with the Victoria Cross. He flew to an airdrome 12 miles within the enemy lines, where 7 machines, some with their engines going, were on the ground. He attacked these from a height of 50 feet, killing one of the mechanics. One of the machines got off the ground, but Bishop fired 15 rounds into it at close range and disposed of a second that rose against him by giving it 30 rounds at a distance of 150 yards. The foe plane fell into a tree. 2 more machines left the ground, and he engaged with these at a height of 1,000 feet and sent one of them down. He then emptied a whole drum of cartridges into the other hostile plane and flew back to his own station. His machine gun was badly battered when he returned. The Spokane Daily Chronicle.
In the summer of 1919, Bishop and William George Barker, a fellow veteran of the war-torn skies over Europe, established Barker Bishop Aeroplanes Limited, a charter flight service. While they did not have a base of operations at Cartierville, it is well within reasoning to say that they would have been making appearances at the airport, especially if they intended to turn profits with their business. One way in which to generate interest was to offer potential clients short hops into the air. Another way, and for the right price, was to let passengers take to the controls. Julian's account of the event includes him having several sessions with Bishop before being allowed to solo, but the veteran aviator more than likely would not have allowed someone with no flying experience the chance to crack up his airplane.
And with no ceremony or preparation, we walked across to the 2-seater plane he was using. He took it up, and then, as we circled the airport, he handed over the controls to me, shouting instructions above the roar of the plane's engine and the rush of the wind.
Although he was very far away from knowing how to truly handle an aircraft at the professional level, when Hubert Julian stepped out of that Sopwith Camel on that chilly November Sunday, he had become quite possibly the first person of color in history to fly an airplane.
On my own up there in the air, suddenly, all my dreams came true. This, I felt, was my real element. At last, I was free from the constraints of the ground, able to glide and soar, bank and dive as I wanted, with a touch on the controls. That first flight was rapturous, a discovery of a new medium unlike any other. I felt I had been admitted into a special brotherhood of the air. Nothing before or since has ever given me a comparable thrill.
To be part of that fraternity of flying men was a great achievement, and on a personal level, and that's what it was all about, is what he wanted to do, and his love of flying showed that.
Nearly 1,000 miles away in central Minnesota, Charles Lindbergh, then 18, was busy convincing farmers that the milking of cows by machine was a great scientific breakthrough. He was a year and a half away from his first flying lesson. If Hubert Julian had been obsessed with aviation before his first flight, his interests would now border on the fanatical. He took advantage of every opportunity that came his way to get back into an airplane, all the while trying to come up with an idea that he could bring into existence in an effort to show that aviation was a viable profession and also aid in saving the lives of pilots. He was determined to do what he could to stop another crash like the one he had witnessed as a child. In the end, Julian would settle on the development of a parachute-based apparatus.
I made models from children's construction kits and other bits and pieces I could find. In the evening, sometimes crowds would gather outside the apartment house where I lived to watch this mad young West Indian drop baskets of eggs attached to different sizes of homemade parachutes from the window.
Julian would come to design a device that would be situated behind the propeller of an airplane within an isolated shaft. In the event that the airplane became distressed and was heading for a crash, the pilot could activate an independently powered fan, which would push a parachute umbrella hybrid apparatus out through the head of the propeller, held onto the frame by cables, and allow the craft to drift down in a vertical position back to the ground. If it did its job successfully, the mechanism could help prevent the deaths of pilots. Julian gave his invention the rather grandiloquent name of a parachute grave pre-resista. Yet, as he described it, the mundane Canadian Patent Office relabeled it an aeroplane safety appliance.
He was certainly thinking kind of foresighted in the right direction to try to come up with a safety device that could save the pilot and the aircraft. Using a parachute to lower a disabled aircraft, which we see now today in the general aviation world with the Cirrus aircraft, where it has a parachute where if you have an engine failure, you can pull the handle and lower the entire airplane down. So he really was a pioneer in thinking along those lines, but he never really developed a practical application for it.
While securing a patent in his country of residence was a step in the right direction, Julian understood the reality of the situation. The United States of America was where he would have to go if anything was going to become of his invention. After World War I, aircraft manufacturing companies had sprung up across the nation. If he were to ever make a profit off of his device, Julian would have to secure an American patent. In order to do that, however, he needed to get his father's blessing, as Henry had made his son promise not to travel there.
This he did because he knew from the experience of his friends and acquaintances of the racial hatred and prejudice which existed there, and he did not want his son to experience it. However, by letter and telegram, I pleaded that it was essential for me to make the journey to Washington, and at last came the permission I sought. But he warned me that I should find conditions very different there, entirely unlike anything I had known in the past.
Julian would arrive in Washington, D.C. in early March 1921. When he entered the patent office, the clerk, a Southerner, laughed at the sight of a black man coming in to register anything other than music. Julian, experiencing a racial attitude that had previously been foreign to him, kindly sought out a more, as he put it, sympathetic clerk.
If someone didn't fully understand the conditions that were created by Jim Crow and enslavement and white supremacy in America, that I could see how maybe he didn't fully understand the context of it, even though he was victim to it himself.
This new individual tried explaining to him that it sometimes took years to secure a patent regardless of the invention's nature and potential. His suggestion for Julian was to try selling it under a patent pending label, which did not sit well with the inventor. This greatly disturbed Julian. He did not wish for his device to be pirated if left unprotected. As it would happen, he did not have much time to stew on the subject. While in Washington, his attorney, William Linton, sent word that a Canadian company had made an offer on the invention. Against his better judgment, which would become somewhat of a trademark for him later on, Julian filed the paperwork on March 9, 1921, leaving copies of the blueprints behind, and got back to Montreal as fast as he could. Upon his arrival, Julian and Linton negotiated the sale of the aeroplane safety appliance to the Gurney Aircraft Corporation for $3,000 plus stock in the company. Then, less than 2 months after filing for it, Julian received a letter informing him that he had been issued U.S. patent number 1379264. He was nothing short of elated. Suddenly and quite unexpectedly, new avenues were opening for him. His dream of working in aeronautics seemed to be coming to fruition. Julian would continue working as a mechanic throughout the rest of 1921. And on October 17th, he married a young woman named Edna Powell in a small ceremony in Montreal, performed by the Reverend Thomas Nelson. But Julian would not stay with his new wife for long. He had a career to build, and it would not be in Canada. Over the course of the year, he and Linton had begun and completed the incorporation with $25,000 of capital stock of the Aeroplane Safety Appliance Company with several partners in Cleveland, Ohio, at the time home to the aircraft manufacturing Glenn L. Martin Company. Against his attorney's advice, Julian resolved to be the one to go down and present his company's invention to the people at Glenn L. Martin. In preparation for the trip, and with more wealth than he had been used to, Julian knew that in order to make an impression on potential buyers, he would need to look the part of a confident businessman.
I went to the best tailors in Montreal, to shirt makers and shoemakers, and bought myself a complete wardrobe, as elegant and distinguished as all those people could make. I also made up my mind that I would arrive in America in style. I realized early in life that people are often taken at the value they put on themselves. If a man is well-dressed, confident, and clearly considers he is someone to be reckoned with, then people will afford him respect and pay attention to what he says and does. I bought a McFarlane from a Montreal firm and set off for a new life in America, driven by a chauffeur hired for the occasion.
In early February 1922, Hubert Julian arrived at the Cleveland plant and walked up to the receptionist to give her his name. As she read his card, her face became pale. Julian, at the time, could not make the connection. He had made an appointment with the manager of the company and some of his top technical advisors. The issue, however, was that at no time had he mentioned the fact that he was black. The scheduled meeting was held, and the manager asked Julian to stay in town so that he and his people could think over their proposed acquirement of the aeroplane safety appliance. This request raised some difficulties.
There was apparently not a single hotel there that I could stay in, and none of the white people would dream of having a Negro in their homes. So, one of the few colored employees in the factory was called in, and he got in touch with the minister of his church, who in turn arranged for me to stay with one of his parishioners. But when I went back to the Glen Martin Company next day, I was told they could not consider my invention. They said it was too advanced for them, but my firm belief is that if I had been white, they would have taken it up and developed it.
His invention is typical of the types of experiences that people of African descent experienced in America. And, you know, it was disheartening to them because they couldn't believe that they could invent things that had a true, genuine use, and it was not accepted.
Having experienced the racism that his father had warned him about, Julian's discouragement was enough that he did not wish to return to his wife back in Montreal as a failure. He knew that there was a large West Indian community living in New York. There he believed he could reassess his situation, come up with a new strategy, and find his purpose in life. Hubert Julian instructed his driver to take him to Harlem, New York City.
Harlem, exciting, exotic, innovative, in the spirited, fast-changing 1920s, this community was a mecca for activists and artists who used it as a forum and a stage where old ways were challenged and new ideas seemed to flow as freely as the era's bathtub gin. Often forgotten is that the Charleston and the Foxtrot, new racial attitudes, hot jazz and cool blues, controversial publications, expressive poetry and prose, and above all, a new black pride came to national attention from the streets of Harlem. For the creative, adventuresome, the blocks beyond Central Park became the place to be. This period became known as the Harlem Renaissance because of the explosion of energy that came out of the darkness of slavery, the segregation laws and lynchings in the South, and the poverty and prejudice in the North, all of which gave rise to a world that was both fun-loving and serious. David M. Maxfield, Smithsonian News Service.
When Julian arrived in Harlem, he had his car parked in a garage, bid his driver farewell, and walked into the elite barbershop, famous for its VIP patrons like tap dancer and actor Bill Bojangles Robinson. Once inside, the young West Indian nodded hellos all around and introduced himself to the establishment's most famous barber, Jimmy Garrett, who agreed to store Julian's luggage and briefcase for a small fee as he got to know his surroundings. As he exited the elite, Julian let it be known to the gentleman there, who did not quite know what to make of him, that he would endeavor to live by his wits. Julian soon found himself taken in by the nightlife. Early on in his stay, he was introduced to a woman who Greater Manhattan called Queenie, but who Harlem residents knew as Madame. Stephanie St. Clair, a native of Martinique, had come to the United States in 1912, joining up with the 40 Thieves gang before striking out on her own. She ran the leading numbers game in Harlem during the 1920s before her authority would be challenged by white rivals after Prohibition ended. When asked what had brought him to the States, he lied to her, saying he was in New York to study medicine in order to support his impoverished parents back home in Trinidad. St. Clair brought him to her salon, allowing him to keep a room on the top floor of the 5-story brownstone. Julian's new landlady, 8 years his senior, had one rule: don't carouse with the girls except for her. He had still neglected to send word of his whereabouts to Edna.
Thinking of Julian as somebody who was an outsider in almost every situation is a good way to think about him. And at times he seemed to be able to use that to his advantage. But at other times, when people did find out about his past history, that sometimes added to his problems as well.
One day by chance, St. Clair ran into Jimmy Garrett on the street. He asked her if she knew of a young West Indian man with an English-sounding accent because he had snuck a peek into his belongings and, having found a large amount of cash, became nervous, thinking it might be stolen. The description matched her new tenant, whom she had given money to in order for him to continue his studies. Considering who he had just managed to lie to, steal from, and enrage, Julian made it out of that brownstone relatively unscathed, save for a clunk on the forehead by his former mistress's right heel. The next day he settled matters with Garrett and handed him a sealed envelope containing $100 addressed to Madam. He continued to frequent popular Harlem night spots like Club Deluxe, owned by former heavyweight boxing champion Jack Johnson. Not one for smoking or drinking, Julian spent his time in those establishments trying to make connections. But creating new friendships is expensive, and by midsummer of 1922, he found himself nearly out of money. Edna, after hearing from friends that her husband was living in Harlem, traveled down to find him. By chance, the two encountered one another on the street. Shocked, Julian hurried his wife over to a bench in St. Nicholas Park. After a short talk, he left for a brief time only to return with a piece of paper and asking Edna for her signature. Seeing that what he wanted signed was a crude divorce agreement, she refused. It is unclear why Julian requested the end to his marriage. His inability to provide income and security probably had a lot to do with it. Unable to reach an understanding, the estranged spouses went their separate ways. Drifting around Harlem and probably sleeping in his car after being unable to pay his bill at the Hotel Olga, Julian, growing more depressed by the day, found himself brought into Liberty Hall, an auditorium owned by Marcus Garvey, founder and leader of the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League.
Garvey's race surpassed his capabilities. He had attributes which enabled him to command a vast Negro following, but his instincts were too strong for his ideals, and he usually wound up in court or in jail. But of all the Negro dreamers who have risen in Harlem to lead the black race to one form of utopia or another, he was the most regal in appearance, the most compelling in manner, and the most articulate. Garvey's dream was to ship all the Negroes to Africa and establish an independent African republic with an army, navy, merchant marine, and parliament. These were only the fundamentals. There was no limit to Garvey's vision. The Montreal Gazette.
The Jamaican-born Garvey's black nationalist and Pan-African philosophies attracted many of Harlem's residents to him, especially those from the Caribbean islands. Julian, having quickly bought into the message of the domineering persona before him, began attending regular meetings at the UNIA-ACL. The newest Garveyite concluded that he would do whatever it took to raise awareness for the organization's goals. Without thinking, Julian announced that he was a pilot. The audience gathered around him were silent. Garvey, believing the newcomer at his word, described Julian as a fighter for our race, and that this young man is doing something to prove that Negroes are the equal of white people if only they are given a chance. His example should inspire us all. Julian, having put his foot in his mouth, now had two options: fade away into the background, pretending he had said nothing, or make good on his lie. Thinking back to the way the Glen L. Martin Company had treated him, the way everyone back home, including his father, thought of his yearning to make something of himself in aviation, he chose the latter and went about crafting a facade people would take seriously. Finding a tailor, Julian had a military uniform fashioned. His next stop was a photographer's studio where he had several shots taken as he held a model airplane in his hands.
The connection between Julian and Garvey, I think, is pretty clear. I mean, they were about show. They were about the clothes making the man. Garvey was all about uniforms, all about titles, and of course, for Julian, titles were important too.
Seemingly out of nowhere and overnight, the Trinidadian had transformed himself into Lieutenant Hubert Julian of the Canadian Air Force. On September 3, 1922, Hubert Julian is recorded to have performed a parachute jump from an altitude of 1,500 feet, landing safely as the band of the all-black 369th Infantry Regiment, formerly the 15th New York National Guard Regiment, played. During World War I, the regiment had earned the nickname of the Harlem Hellfighters. It was a humble start for a man who had just announced his intentions to help push for the advancement of blacks, yet as far as recorded history goes, Julian may have on that day become the first black to perform a parachute jump.
Being a parachutist in the early 20s, it was really dangerous. It's still dangerous now. You couldn't really control them once you jumped out. You couldn't steer them, and they, sometimes they didn't open.
But also on this day, a young woman, described as the only negress aviatrix, made 3 short flights around Curtis Field. Her name was Bessie Coleman. A native Texan, Coleman was the daughter of a 3/4 Choctaw Indian and 1/4 black man who picked cotton for a living. After moving to Chicago to work in a barber shop, her interest in flying began to develop. When offered admittance into one aviation school on the condition that she pretend to be white, Coleman refused. She found a benefactor in Robert S. Abbott, founder of the Chicago Defender, who, seeking the sort of story that would sell newspapers, sent her to France, where in 1921 she earned her pilot's license, becoming the first black woman to do so. Shortly after her exhibition in Long Island, Coleman was asked by a reporter why she took up the game of flying.
Well, because I knew we had no aviators, neither men nor women, and I knew the race needed to be represented along this racially important line. So I thought it my duty to risk my life to learn aviating and to encourage flying among men and women of the race who are so far behind the white men in this special line. I made up my mind to try. I tried and was successful. Bessie Coleman.
Can we see the airplane as representing the African American political imagination? I'm not sure about that. Some other writers, like George Schuyler, talks a lot about African Americans using air power and really competing with the white world.
Without funds and a pilot's license, Julian's avenues to achieving his ambitions were limited. In order to earn press and wages, he would have to continue making jumps. So when he heard that Charles Casey Jones of the Curtis Field Staff was to host an air show to honor the memory of Lieutenant Belvin W. Maynard, the Flying Parson, Julian headed out with a rented parachute that he had not had much time to acquaint himself with the usage of. Jones introduced him to his pilot, Slim Henneke. Together, they positioned the parachute next to the airplane's undercarriage. The type of craft they were using would require Julian to climb out of the cockpit, onto the wing, ultimately making his way underneath the nose before fitting himself into the harness. With a crowd of over 2,500 in attendance, Henneke brought the plane up to 2,000 feet. The wind tore at Julian's hair, lips, and limbs. His half-closed eyes were full of tears. But when they hit an air pocket that caused a sudden drop of 100 feet, Julian was thrown off his perch. He grabbed the first thing that he could, a red-hot exhaust pipe that badly burned his hands. The force of his grip snapped it, and Julian tumbled out. Still a novice, he did not yet know how to manipulate the lines of his parachute, and found himself drifting out over Westbury, finally crashing into a chicken coop.
As all the hens ran squawking away in a panic, out came the farmer himself, with a shotgun in his hand, apparently expecting to find a thief in his farmyard. I was much more frightened by that indignant farmer than I was by the jump from the plane. "Hold on! Hold on!" I shouted as I disentangled myself from the parachute. "It's a messenger from heaven, come to call on you." With a look of amazement on his face, the farmer put up his gun, and, as I was still shouting incoherently, a moment later, a car from the airfield arrived, ready to take me back there. Thankfully, I scrambled in, as the farmer, still looking bewildered, watched me and my helpers.
When Julian arrived back at Curtis Field, Jones greeted him with a warm smile and a pat on the back. Seeing the potential in a spectacle like Julian, he wrote down the name of a barnstormer who worked out of New Jersey. Once the winter was over, Jones instructed Julian to head out to Hasbrook Heights and meet with this pilot. On a chilled afternoon in March 1923, Hubert Julian walked into the ramshackle little hangar of Clarence Chamberlain. The native Iowan had been a member of the Army Signal Corps during World War I, but had not seen combat. On the day of the armistice, coinciding with his 25th birthday, Chamberlain had been on a ship in Hoboken, New Jersey, ready to set sail for Europe. With the end of the fighting, he decided to remain in the area, foreseeing the boom in the aviation business. When Julian found him, Chamberlain was lying under the wing of one of half a dozen airplanes, surplus from the Great War, in varying stages of repair. "Good morning, Major," he said. "I'm Lieutenant Hubert Julian, just down from Canada, looking for an opportunity to pursue my profession. I follow the parachute jumping business. Maybe you've heard of some of my jumps up around Montreal." Chamberlain, unprepared for a guest quite like this, and who was not a major, read over Jones's letter of introduction and agreed to take Julian up for a couple of jumps. So, as Julian put it, he would not get rusty. Because the supposed career jumper did not actually own a parachute, Chamberlain had to supply him with one. When asked if he preferred to make his jumps out of the cockpit or the wing, Julian, remembering the burns he had suffered, answered with, "Lord, I quit doing pull-offs more than a year ago. I go bang right out of the cockpit." Chamberlain brought his old Avro up to around 3,000 feet. As he leveled the plane, the signal was given for Julian to jump. He froze. After 4 more times around, Chamberlain, fed up, landed the airplane and demanded to know why Julian had not jumped. The concept of having to step up and out was probably too much for the only two-time parachutist to bear. So without another option, Julian relented to making the jump from off the wing. They went up again, and this time Julian performed his first flawless jump. After 3 more times, Chamberlain began to regard the stranger as a legitimate daredevil of the sky. Julian, feeling he was ready for more public showings, asked that if he could find sponsorship for new parachuting stunts, would Chamberlain serve as his pilot. Much to his chagrin, Chamberlain agreed, but asked for $25 in advance. Julian, with little choice at this point, handed over the asked-for deposit.
An unusual advertising stunt was attempted in the interest of the A.I. Hart Company Incorporated on Sunday afternoon, April 15th, when Lieutenant Hubert Julian, formerly of the Canadian Air Forces, attempted to make a parachute drop from an aeroplane into a vacant lot near 7th Avenue and 140th Street. He was to have carried a mysterious message to a large audience assembled at Renaissance Casino. The New York Age.
Chamberlain, leveling out his de Havilland, signaled for Julian to make his move. The parachutist, gazing out over cityscape at roughly 3,000 feet in the air, found himself clutching the strut of the airplane.
As the parachute spun us round with itself as a pivot, the pole veered through 90 degrees until it was straight out from the body of the ship, and in that instant, the strut let go. Screaming and kicking, my erstwhile passenger was launched sideways into space, a piece of the broken strut clutched desperately in his arms. The agonized look on his face was wholly unwarranted, as the undamaged parachute immediately began easing him earthward. But to him, death must have seemed awfully close. Clarence Chamberlain.
Landing near the banks of the Hudson River, Julian proceeded, after gathering his wits, to read a statement on behalf of Mr. Hart, whose business, a 5, 10, and 25-cent store, was on the verge of being bought out by a white-owned company. Hart himself stepped up next and implored the citizens of Harlem to help increase patronage. It was decided by the UNIA-ACL that Julian should make another jump while still fresh in the public's minds. Signs were created and posted around Harlem that read, "Watch the clouds," and in small print at the bottom, admission $1. On April 29, 1923, Chamberlain brought Julian up to 3,500 feet above Harlem. Without hesitating this time, he jumped, garbed in a crimson jumpsuit he had purchased for the occasion.
I tore a hole in a 15-pound bag of flour I was holding, so that there was a dramatic long white trailer for the 500 feet or so I fell freely. Then I pulled the ripcord, the chute opened, and I was swinging gently over those thousands of people there below. And with a slight breeze blowing, I was heading for the 8th Avenue L with a train roaring along. Desperately, I pulled on the parachute guidelines. Though I missed certain death on the rail tracks, my landing was none too easy.
You know, you had blacks who had just came from the South, slightly post what I call the first Great Migration. And then you have this bigger-than-life guy jumping in the river. I can only imagine how they must have felt, much less how that was presented.
The throngs of onlookers pressed so tightly against the ground floor windows of the 3-story tenement Julian had landed on that several broke. Atop the roof, Julian, remembering his sponsors for that day, quickly unhooked his harness, pinned the Honig optical business card on his chest, and flung over himself a sash advertising a St. Louis-based hair straightening product. He made his way down the fire escape where 4 policemen approached him, issuing a summons for inciting a riot. Those witnessing the handoff feared Julian was being arrested, and so picked him up on their shoulders and carried him off to Liberty Hall in celebration.
But it would have been a great sense of pride that people would have had to say, yeah, there you go. There's nothing that we can't do, even fall from the sky and live.
Once inside, Julian handed reporters his business card, which read, Lieutenant Hubert Julian, MD, the world's champion daredevil aviator. When asked if he was, in fact, a doctor, Julian laughed, telling them the MD stood for mechanical draftsman. Less than a week later, Julian appeared in court to answer the summons he had been issued.
Apparently, the judge could not find that I had done anything wrong. So, he did not fine me. But I had been the cause of a breach of the peace, he said. And the same thing would happen again if I made any more parachute jumps. So he banned me from flying over New York City for 6 months.
Over the course of his 6-month suspension, Julian, who had fast become the noble, heroic knight that Marcus Garvey had sought to find, began rallying people to the Black is Beautiful banner. He gave lectures in Atlantic City, Philadelphia, and Detroit, receiving a handsome fee for his services. It was during this time, due to his very public fame, when he was reunited with one Essie Gittens, a young woman slightly his senior. The two had been friends during his childhood back in Trinidad. A relationship quickly developed, and Julian felt compelled to write a letter to Edna confessing his transgression.
Dear babe, Edna dear, I am sorry, but as a young man I kept myself long enough. I am sorry to the bottom of my heart, but it is too late now. It happened on the 29th day of April, so baby, I am helpless. She is not a young girl, but she is 27 years old, and I knew her years ago. She is from my home. Now, baby, I have told you all, and as I am writing you, tears are in my eyes. I hope you will forgive me, baby, darling, and also forget me. Yours, sorrowfully, Hubert Julian, aeronaut.
Edna hired the famous black detective Herbert Boulin to track her husband's whereabouts and dealings, ultimately having Julian served with separation papers on October 4, 1923. In an interview conducted by the Chicago Defender, Edna called her spouse out on claiming to have been a lieutenant with the Canadian Air Force. Not much mind was paid to this, because less than 1 month prior, Julian, his suspension over, and finding sponsorship this time with the Martin Saxophone Company, slipped on his crimson jumpsuit, took off with Chamberlain piloting, and parachuted down into Harlem playing Runnin' Wild on a sax. Still unable to control his touchdowns, he found himself landing hard upon a rooftop, getting dragged along via the parachute. Before going over the ledge, he grabbed a flagpole, unhooked his harness, and breathed in a sigh of relief. He then realized the building he had landed on was a police station.
None of the officers realized what was going on, and as they heard the terrible smash of broken glass above them, they came tearing out onto the roof with drawn guns in their hands. When the lieutenant saw it was me, he called out, "Oh, it's all right, boys. It's just that crazy nigger trying to kill himself again."
Prior to this jump, the newspapers had been calling him the Ace of Spades. But after the ruckus caused by the landing on the police station, H. Allen Smith, working at that time for the Herald Tribune, bestowed upon Hubert Julian the moniker he would embrace and never let go of for the rest of his life. Smith had christened him the Black Eagle of Harlem.
The final goal of all the ambitions which flying men have ventured to dream since the Wright brothers first rose from the earth in a heavier-than-air machine was realized this morning when two young British officers, Captain John Alcock and Lieutenant Arthur W. Brown, landed on the Irish coast after the first non-stop flight across the Atlantic Ocean. It was a straightway, clean-cut flight achieved in 16 hours and 12 minutes from Newfoundland to Clifton, Ireland, a distance of more than 1,960 miles. The Gazette Times, June 16, 1919.
Transatlantic flights had been undertaken before and after Alcock and Brown's. Their nonstop hop showed the potential in aviation becoming a staple in traversing long stretches of area without the need for refueling. Julian, having spent 1923 parachuting into the popular culture of the era, had a revelation, due in part to Marcus Garvey's grooming over the course of that winter.
The trouble was that all the West Indians supported me and made me their hero, while the American Negroes claimed I was doing nothing special. So if these Americans wanted to deride me, I thought I would really show them something. And I hit on the idea of a solo flight from America to Africa, and in particular Liberia as the destination, as it was the only Negro republic in the world then. And I was true to my aim of drawing attention to the abilities and achievements of the Negro race.
For someone who had very little actual piloting experience, Julian was serious and did not tolerate anyone who questioned his vigor. Over the course of 1923, Chamberlain had been teaching his parachuting partner the fundamentals of flying. At best, Julian was probably capable of piloting an airplane straight and level in good weather. But only the Black Eagle knew his own limits, and Chamberlain would not have associated himself with a hack.
Given the state of America at the time, to have such a well-known white aviator befriend and help out this black aviator, I think was a really kind of a unique story, their friendship. And you would have to assume that Chamberlain had some degree of confidence in Julian's flying ability if he was willing to, help him out and be seen with him and be known as one of his supporters.
Julian had no intention of making his transatlantic flight a non-stop one, as the technology of the time did not yet allow for it based on the distance he intended to travel. The proposed flight plan, as he saw it, was to skirt the eastern seaboard down to Florida, where he would then proceed to make stops across the Caribbean islands en route to South America, finally turning eastward, making for the Liberian capital of Monrovia. In order to make this dream a reality, Chamberlain suggested that an old hydroplane left over from World War I be purchased and specially adapted with extra fuel tanks and a minimum amount of unnecessary weight. Outside funding would be fundamental in achieving these plans, so Julian set up a meeting with James Weldon Johnson, secretary of the NAACP. Julian explained that in a world of blackbirds and white doves, the latter were soaring higher and in greater numbers. Johnson looked over the budget. Julian had pledged $7,500 of his own money and was in need of an additional $5,000 to meet the bare minimum for a successful flight. The NAACP, according to Johnson, was incorporated to help blacks out in courts and would not join in helping this project come to fruition. Julian, stunned and angered by Johnson's apparent lack of vision, had also to face some public criticism against him. One black-run newspaper insisted that on the day of takeoff, the airplane would disappear into the hands of whites, its true owners. In order to combat this sort of thinking, Julian decided that those he was trying to elevate should participate in the project's funding.
It seemed to me that as the flight was going to be in aid of the Negro people, there was no reason why they should not contribute. So I invited all the Negroes in the United States to donate a few cents each. But the project was so strange to them, so far in advance of anything they knew, that they just could not believe it.
The idea of soliciting public funding through the mail was nothing new. Marcus Garvey and his Black Star Steamship Company had done it before, gotten brought up on charges, and found guilty of committing mail fraud. Julian was unaware of the fact that the federal government, from the moment he first began seeking contributions, had him under a microscope. While discussing the flight plans with Chamberlain in the latter's hangar, James E. Amos, one of the first black special agents in the Federal Bureau of Investigation and who had worked the Garvey case, paid Julian a visit. Amos informed him that the $1 donations being asked for by Julian of blacks everywhere was suspicious, and that the Black Eagle should seriously consider making sure he went through with his proposed flight, or else.
I don't see him as a sort of money laundering type fraud. Now, this is just how I view him and how what I feel about his narrative and who he was. I think his motivation was showmanship. If he had to tell a few white lies or even outright lies along the way, this is all part of making his way in the world, making his own opportunities.
Julian got the message, and in order to silence the criticism from all angles and generate more support, had the hydroplane brought to a rented corner lot in Harlem. He and Chamberlain would work on the aircraft there on the spot and start up the engines every Sunday. Money began to trickle in.
Amateur bookies were laying 10 to 1 that the plane would never get off the ground. Others said that it was just another of my publicity stunts, that I cared not a cuss for the advancement of the Negro race, they said, but was concerned only with myself. To make the point quite clear, I had the legend dedicated to the advancement of the Negro race painted on the side of the plane, and as I aimed to fly to Liberia, the only Negro republic, I thought it right to call the plane Ethiopia, in honor of the only black kingdom.
He was a Trinidadian. He did not see himself as an American Negro. He did not see himself as a coming up from slavery. He saw himself as a man. He did not see blacks as they saw themselves. He saw blacks as they could be greater than what they were specifically for the time.
The scheduled date of takeoff, July 4th, 1924, arrived. By 9 a.m., the police estimated a crowd of 30,000. Vendors eventually ran out of hot dogs, hot pig's feet, watermelon, ices, and soda pop. Authorized and unauthorized photos of Julian were being sold. Orange balloons were being handed out so as to be released into the air when the Black Eagle took off. The Ethiopia, settled in the waters of the Harlem River, remained idle beyond its 1:30 p.m. departure time. Julian, garbed in a blue uniform and black leather cavalry boots and still owing $1,400 on the hydroplane, was being held back from even entering it by the financial partners Chamberlain had needed to bring in order to complete the modifications to it. He began imploring to those in attendance to chip in whatever they had in their pockets, but by 2 p.m., without any resolution and soaked in perspiration, Julian became irate upon realizing the tide had gone out and the Ethiopia was now embedded in mud. With the sun beginning its descent over New Jersey, patches of spectators convinced no flight would take place started to disperse. Special Agent Amos, making himself conspicuous, approached the would-be pilot, offering him a handshake. This was it for Julian. Facing jail time, he sought out William Wellington Grant, one of the UNIA ACL's officers, for help. Grant, learning what was needed, sent his men out into the crowd, raising $400 in the name of Marcus Garvey. Chamberlain's partners took the money and informed Julian he would need to make good on the remaining $1,000 upon his return, from wherever he might end up.
My father had all intentions of making that flight and putting his name in the record and history books. He wasn't a con man, he wasn't a charlatan. He did what he wanted to do, and that was it. He was a man of his word, and he kept his word even if it meant his life.
Julian had the hydroplane towed out of the mud, but in the process of doing so, the right pontoon sustained damage. After an inspection, Chamberlain informed Julian that takeoff would be impossible, or at the very least, extremely difficult and dangerous. Julian, still able to see Amos in the crowd, decided that he would go through with the flight, but that Chamberlain would need to meet him down in Atlantic City, the first stop on his planned route, with a replacement pontoon. At around 5 p.m., the Ethiopia's engine came to life. It roared forward through the calm waters of the Harlem River, skipped, hopped, and ascended into the skies amid the sounds of a marching band and cheering well-wishers. Thousands of orange balloons began to rise slowly in its wake.
I began to bank, to swing it again over the crowd, and only then did I realize that something was seriously wrong. The knock which the pontoon had taken on the way to the water had clearly opened it up. Then, during takeoff, the float had scooped up gallons of water. Climbing steadily, this had no effect, but as soon as I went into a turn and banked, the water rushed to one side of the float, and the sudden jerk pulled that wing down. No matter what I did, I just could not correct it. Faster and faster, the plane slipped sideways and was soon completely out of control. It was impossible even to straighten it into a dive from which I might have managed to get into a landing position. Right up to the moment I hit the sea, I kept struggling to balance the plane, but it was hopeless. It went into the water, wing first, and still in the cockpit, I went under with it.
Immortal Darius Green was white. Disgusted by the silly wax of Icarus, him and his daddy Daedalus, he made his machine of leather or something or other, and failed just the same. That the white green was a bit blue when he came down in the barnyard may be taken for granted. A black Darius Green was equally blue over his experiment with the Ethiopia hydroplane. He may try again. Hope springs eternal in the human breast. What is clear enough, even to the best friends of the Negroes, is that their genius runs to music, to poetry, to oratory, and not to higher mathematics or higher mechanics. Yet Caucasians who can remember how funny the original Yankee Darius was to their unprophetic minds may well restrain any disposition to Guy Hubert Julian. Hitching your wagon to a star is a worthy aim. Emerson himself would have acknowledged that a vital preliminary is getting away from the earth. Julian is an Emersonian in disguise so palpable that it has betrayed him. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle.
The entire time in the air amounted to no less than 7 minutes. Julian, crashing into Flushing Bay, had been able to free himself from the confines of the hydroplane's cockpit. A man named Frederick Hess, caulking boats along the shore, saw the wreck and headed out to pull the half-drowned pilot from the water. Julian awoke the next morning in Flushing Hospital. His shoulders were dislocated, and his leg was in traction. He could barely breathe without it causing him a considerable amount of pain. When someone entered the room, Julian could see it was Amos. He had come to inform Julian that he had done his best, and that if luck was against him, then that certainly was not a crime that the federal government could prosecute. His head covered in bandages and looking like the Invisible Man, Julian, on a fair amount of pain medication, told his visitor, "I almost made it." After his discharge from Flushing Hospital, Julian, joined by Essie, traveled down to Atlantic City, where he spent several weeks recuperating. If privacy was his intent, he did not receive it. His crash had made him even more famous than before. Yet he found it discouraging and strange that the white-run newspapers sided with him based off courage and drive, while the black-run ones viewed him as a fraud and self-centered showman. All he could do was take the criticism in stride and heal. There would be no more parachuting or flying for him through 1924. Julian's goal was to find more sponsors who would help keep money in his pocket as he planned his next project. Even trying to do that was anything but easy. Over the course of his rehabilitation, the Black Eagle discovered that Special Agent Amos had had assistance with investigating his motives in the solicitation of funds, a detective who had previously worked a Julian-centric case already. And when the two parties came face to face in May 1925, it was not to exchange pleasantries. Julian, selling razors on a street corner as a spokesman for the Gem Safety Razor Company, saw his antagonist and called him out.
Many fight fans who did not go to the Commonwealth Saturday night witnessed an exhibition free of charge at 140th Street and 7th Avenue between Kid Herbert Boulin, head of the well-known detective agency, and Kid Hubert Julian of airship fame. The scrap had the Commonwealth beaten in that there was no referee, at least not until many hours later. Boulin, with a badly swollen eye, claims victory on a foul. Julian, with several bits of flesh nicked out of his cheek and contusions behind the left ear, claims that by right he is the complainant. Magistrate Brodsky fined Julian $5 or 5 days. The New York Amsterdam News.
Julian appealed the decision, but in the end had to pay the fine. Once healed up from the crash a year before as well as the fight, he went back to parachuting, but in more controlled environments. He suffered injury in September 1925 during the annual police games while trying to turn the propeller in preparation of a jump. Both wrists sustained fractures. Sidelined again, Julian attended the Long Island Air Races the following month as a spectator, where he saw a monoplane designed by the well-known Italian-born Giuseppe Balanca and built by the Wright Aeronautical Company of Paterson, New Jersey, perform brilliantly. It was the only one of its kind at the time. After winning the efficiency race, Julian realized that this airplane was the type of craft he should have waited for to make his transatlantic flight. His eyes widened, his mind whirled, and the Black Eagle decided that once he was back at 100%, his dream of flying to Africa would be revisited.
Members of the Negro race, I again come before you, appealing for your financial support in making possible the purchase of a new plane. Mr. Balanca, the designer, told his company that Julian is not only a competent and capable flyer, but with the plane that is half airworthy, he will be able to perform wonders. There are thousands of young men today who are just dying to learn to master the art of flying. That opportunity will not be given until we have proven that the same spirit of intrepidity that actuates members of the Nordic race, when historians will rewrite the pages of history, when they come to the celebration of the 150th anniversary of independence, our children will read that one of the greatest contributions to that historic event was contributed by members of our race.
Julian, learning from his previous attempt at seeking public funding, arranged to have all donations sent to the Chelsea Bank under the heading Special Airplane Fund. The total amount he needed was $10,000, and the bank would proceed with the payment to Wright Aeronautical directly. Unfortunately for Julian, Balanca's employers refused to sell their award-winning monoplane to him.
Certainly with his limited means as a black aviator, he only had the worst airplanes. And that's all he could afford. That's all he could raise money for. Nobody was going to give him a brand new state-of-the-art airplane.
Faced with having to find a suitable aircraft to make the flight, he settled on a 30-foot-long Fokker seaplane with a 50-foot wingspan and sporting twin Wright Whirlwind engines. Subsequently, the minimum amount for a successful flight went up to $15,000. Julian found backers, among which were Tiger Flowers, middleweight boxing champion of the world, who donated $5,000, and Standard Oil, who pledged the entirety of the flight's needed gasoline and oil. Over the course of late summer 1926, Julian oversaw the construction of the Fokker at Port Newark in the hangar of the Flyed Flying School in order to build a final round of support and press coverage before bringing the seaplane down to Philadelphia for its takeoff. Julian had it brought to Happyland Park in Harlem, but kept the wings stored in St. Mark's schoolyard. The next day, when he went to retrieve them, he found the wings destroyed, the victim of vandals. The newspapers described the unknown perpetrators as jealous and disgruntled individuals, and Julian believed them to be madmen from the opposition, meaning those of his own race who did not support his endeavors.
People sometimes despise other people's successes and have done things to the disadvantage of their success. And I think Julian's case gives us a great opportunity to think about how do we transform that negative energy so that it doesn't repeat itself. And I think that we have to look at that in ways that gives us opportunities for success in the future.
Distraught at this turn of events, Julian canceled the flight. It is unclear what happened to the money. The Black Eagle sent his team home, telling them that that particular episode of their lives was over. They had tried, and due to circumstances they could not control, failed. It was time to look to the future.
The first failure, I felt, was nobody's fault. The second was a willful and deliberate piece of sabotage, the result of ignorance and prejudice. Hurt and injured as I was, I made up my mind to gain what experience and knowledge I could from all that happened, and to press ahead.
The civilized world has had two thrills in the last 3 weeks. The first came on May 21st when the news was flashed across the ocean that Captain Charles A. Lindbergh, traveling alone in a monoplane, crossed the ocean at night in the midst of rain, sleet, and fog and landed at Paris, France. The second thrill came on June 6th when the news was broadcast that Clarence D. Chamberlain, accompanied by Charles A. Levine, crossed the ocean and landed in Germany. Let us hope, however, that some Negro youth, inspired by this feat of Lindbergh's, will begin a serious apprenticeship in aeronautics. And let us hope that he will show the same stamina in the face of ridicule and the lack of interest in whatever project he may attempt to put across, and the same modesty in the face of success. The New York Amsterdam News, June 22nd, 1927.
The summer of 1927 saw feats of accomplishment in aviation that no one in the general public would have expected to happen. The third famous crossing of that flying season would be commanded by Richard E. Byrd and his crew. Suddenly, the entire Western world knew the names of these heroic pilots as well as the names of their ships. The Spirit of St. Louis, the Columbia, and the America. Ticker tape parades were held for these aviators, and people everywhere could not get enough of them. They were the superstars of their day.
What happened in the summer of 1927 just changed the world forever. It just popularized aviation. Everybody wanted to get in on aviation. They wanted to buy airplanes. They wanted to learn how to fly. They were buying souvenirs of Lindbergh and building airplane models.
For Hubert Julian, however, all of this must have been bittersweet and a hard pill to swallow. This man had been doing everything within his power to pull off a transatlantic flight, yet had produced nothing. His 1927 did not amount to anything that the press felt was newsworthy. Not even his marriage to Essie on June 30th would make headlines. He was overshadowed by the three white pilots, one of which had been a close friend and business partner, and the Black Eagle felt more depressed than ever before. The newlyweds would honeymoon and settle in their new home in Harlem. Essie would suffer at least one miscarriage over the course of their marriage, and the couple would never have a biological child. An orphan cousin of theirs from Essie's side of the family, a young girl named Olga, was taken in by the Julians and raised as their own. Despite the failures of his first two attempts to pilot a successful transatlantic flight, Julian, spurred on by the achievements of the three ocean hoppers of 1927, began putting together the pieces of once again setting off across the open seas.
The man just had an indomitable spirit. He just did not want to give up. Once he set his mind to something, it had to be done. And once again, being a black man in that time, it speaks volumes to his personal integrity and his will to succeed.
Joining forces with aviation enthusiast New York State Senator A. Spencer Feld, the two agreed upon a deal for raising funds in order to purchase a new $25,000 Belanca-made airplane, and that Julian would not only fly nonstop to Paris, but that he would return as well, never having landed upon French soil.
Giuseppe Belanca was always looking for some way to promote his aircraft so he could sell more of them. And I think having this black pilot, might have actually helped sell airplanes. You had to be a fairly decent pilot to fly a Belanca because it was a big, heavy plane, and it took some degree of skill to handle it. And the fact that he survived flying through the 1920s, I mean, he had to have a fair degree of skill because so many pilots at that period, they didn't survive.
This venture is to be no fiasco. Before going into this matter, I gave it very careful thought and consideration, as I had to consider my reputation. Therefore, I placed Julian under contract that is binding, and which provides that in the event he does not live up to its stipulations, by willing to undergo the necessary training or growing careless in his personal conduct, I may withdraw. He will be held in strict accountability to me from now until the time he flies. A. Spencer Feld.
Feld brought on Lieutenant Herbert H. Wilkie of the 369th Infantry Regiment and businessman T.A. Glemm to help in coordinating the fundraising and marketing of the flight. Julian would go on to tour the Midwest, performing for crowds in Detroit and Chicago, the latter which saw him banned from making a Memorial Day parachute jump over Bessie Coleman's grave, the aviatrix having tragically died in a plane crash 2 years prior. Upon returning to New York, the team held a press conference at Curtis Field, where a newsreel camera crew was there to capture Julian and Feld's excitement over their partnership.
This is a non-commercial proposition. There is no prize to be gained, and I have no desire for personal aggrandizement, whether it be material or honorary. The sole purpose of my proposed flight is to stimulate a greater interest in aviation among my own people. Too much stress cannot be laid on the fact that this flight is not being attempted for commercial purposes, but solely in the interest of the flying game and to help Negroes anxious to take up the science. It is certain that if another war comes, it must be fought in the air.
Blacks were split on the project down generational lines. The older thought Julian's planned flight was reckless and would prove nothing to the world, especially if he died trying.
I think that the aim is a noble one, and worthy of Mr. Julian's ambition and nerve. Although I wish him every success in his attempt, I must say frankly that I am not in harmony with the project because of the great hazard and long odds against which Mr. Julian would have to contend. If a misfortune should befall Mr. Julian while he is seeking to carve his name in the Hall of Fame, then what will he leave behind him to perpetuate his memory? A more concrete and more secure example of attainment would be the establishment of a flying school for Harlem youth. Clifford J. Rogers, the New York Amsterdam News.
The younger generation, however, saw the Black Eagle as a folk hero. They had grown up hearing and reading about the stories of this man who seemed larger than life. One young man, Lincoln Payne of Philadelphia, penned a letter in the Pittsburgh Courier, begging Julian to accept him as his co-pilot despite his limited time as a flying student. Payne expressed his deep wish that he could assist the Black Eagle in making a successful flight and return journey across the Atlantic happen. Julian was more than flattered, but provided no formal response as he did not want to deflate the ambitions of his admirers or risk anyone's life other than his own.
We've always needed heroes who make us strive for excellence. So when you take a Julian, when you take a Marcus Garvey, when you take a W.E.B. Du Bois, all these folks strove for excellence, and their push for that creates a kind of a image of what should I be doing as an everyday citizen.
As the spring of 1928 gave way to summer, Julian had yet to set a firm date for takeoff, and as he continued to delay, others would make the oceanic crossing, including the first woman to do it, Amelia Earhart. With that, Julian suddenly became yesterday's news, largely in part to his own inability to execute the plan laid out by his committee, headed up by Feld. The tabloids had their fun at his expense.
Our faith has not been the same, although our interest has never lagged. Julian is one of our favorite truth is stranger than fiction characters. For a long while, he raised money, until it almost seemed as if he preferred raising money to flying. During this period, he was more elusive than a political figure. But in an exclusive with us, he revealed that he was on the very verge of waking up some morning and saying to his wife, "My dear, I think I'll fly to Arabia today." The New York Sun.
As July came and went, the state senator saw indifference settle into Julian's attitude, and sensing his own reputation about to be tarnished, withdrew his support, his partners, and his funds, leaving the Black Eagle to abandon the flight. This would be the last time Julian ever seriously considered a transatlantic flight, but his ocean-crossing exploits were just a few years away. "1929 proved to be a year of inaction, stirring restlessness in the Black Eagle. After Wall Street laid its egg, the businesses Julian had relied upon to sponsor his exploits were now folding up. On April 19, 1930, as he sat listening to the weather forecasts on an Atwater, Kent radio, there came a knock at the door of his apartment at 24 Lenox Avenue. When he answered, Julian found himself staring face to face with a young man who introduced himself as Malaku E. Bayan, cousin of Rastafari, soon, upon receiving his crown, to be known as Haile Selassie, Emperor of Ethiopia, the Lion of Judah. Bayan explained to Julian that Tafari had heard and read of his adventures. The Crown Prince had been particularly flattered over the fact that the 2 airplanes Julian had intended to fly across the Atlantic had been named after his kingdom. But Bayan was not there to simply exchange pleasantries. His cousin had sent him on a mission. Tafari wished to turn his poor, underdeveloped country into a modern state, strong enough to avoid becoming a colony under European control. Julian, to him, represented the future of this reform. The Black Eagle was being asked to travel to Ethiopia, embarking on the trip in just 7 days in order to help organize an air force that would eventually protect the African nation, also known as Abyssinia, from outsider aggression, as well as serve as the future emperor's personal pilot. Julian, dumbfounded, told his visitor he would, of course, have to consult with his wife before making any decision. Bayan informed him that he would come calling again the next day. When, as he returned home after an unsuccessful search for a housekeeping job, she listened to what had transpired in her absence and was against the entire proposition. She feared Africa and thought of it as a place so far from civilization that to accept an invitation to go there would be like accepting a death sentence.
Both white and black writers, outsiders writing about Africa, have responded to the continent either as this dreamland sometimes, but more often as this barbaric, nightmarish place, and many African Americans felt that way.
But Julian, who did not want his wife becoming a housekeeper, insisted that he would be safe. Hours of arguments followed before she relented, with one condition. Julian could make the trip if a salary of $1,000 a month was prescribed to him. Shock must have hit her system when Bayan agreed. Her husband was now permitted to make the trip, but she would stay behind. 1 week later, accompanied by Bayan, Julian boarded the SS Europa, arriving in Paris on May 1st. After a 2-week stay in the French capital, they sailed from Marseille, arriving in Djibouti on June 5th.
As I stood at the ship's rail, watching the African coast draw near, my heart was full. I felt I was coming home, and I looked on all the dark-skinned people on the shore as part of my family. So overcome was I that as soon as the ship docked, I ran down the gangway and knelt and kissed that first dirty, dusty piece of Africa on which I had set foot.
From their point of debarkation, it was a 3-day journey by way of an old single-line track train to the Ethiopian capital of Addis Ababa. They would make stops at Dire Dawa and Awash before arriving exhausted at their final destination. Bayan set Julian up in a comfortable house, and it would be 5 days before he would be received by the Crown Prince.
The emperor's old wooden palace dominated the town from its hilltop, with the long drive down to what passed as the center, a small collection of brick-built, corrugated, iron-roofed buildings surrounded on all sides by the shacks and huts of the common people. Beyond those crazily built homes, the eucalyptus trees rose like a solid green wall, here and there cut by a few roads leading out of the capital, only a couple of them properly paved, and the rest mere beaten tracks, which turned into quagmires when it rained.
Barefoot, putty-wearing sentries gave a salute and opened the black iron gates for him to pass through. He was led by a sword-wielding guard, passing 2 chained sleeping lions, and at the steps to the palace was greeted by the royal chamberlain, clad in a blue cape. Julian's first glimpse of Tafari was of a regal-looking man sitting upon a red velvet-covered chair with gold trimming under a large chandelier. They discussed, mostly in French, and with the aid of the chamberlain as translator, Julian's journey, his now famous aeronautical career, and what his role in the kingdom would be. Tafari informed him that there were already foreign pilots, 2 Frenchmen in the country, preparing to help start an air force. Julian would be joining them in this endeavor. Before the meeting concluded, the Crown Prince whispered something to the chamberlain, who, and then in English, asked Julian if he could put on a flying exhibition within the next 2 days. He responded in the affirmative. There were only 3 airplanes in the country, 2 German-made Junkers monoplanes and 1 British-made Gypsy Moth. The latter had arrived only just the week before, and the all-white exterior impressed Tafari so much that he decreed the sleek little biplane his favorite. No one would fly it until the day of his coronation, when he himself would serve as its first passenger. Captain André Maillet, the senior of the 2 French pilots, was a chunky man, graying at the temples. His younger counterpart was a taciturn-looking young man with a mustache. Julian, upon their first meeting, disliked and distrusted them both immediately.
They were on to a good thing in Addis Ababa, and had no desire to train the Ethiopians too fast, and thus do themselves out of an easy job. They were also concerned in the palace intrigue, which was constantly going. They were taking bribes from everyone possible to use their influence in various ways, and then usually doing nothing. I could not go along with the Frenchmen in their ways, and very soon an uneasy tension had grown up between us, although we had to work together, training the Ethiopians.
Julian grew to believe the Frenchmen were out to get him. Becoming sick after dinner one evening, Julian privately accused them of trying to poison him. They were open about their cynicism towards the Trinidadian, who had, as they saw it, come to muscle them out of an easy gig.
The reason why Julian had issues was he never actually flew an aircraft more than so many miles. And to be fair, these guys were pros. He may have had delusions of grandeur there, or purported himself to be more than he was. And the French probably called him on it. Julian hadn't did anything, he was just all talk. As they say, all hat and no cattle.
But like it or not, the 3 would have to work together in order to put on the air show that Tafari had requested. This private showcase ended up with a spectating crowd of thousands, all lined up behind ropes, eager to see this black man from a faraway land perform feats beyond their wild imaginations. Tafari, having arrived via a crimson Rolls-Royce, took his seat under a tent. Julian was driven by a limousine, and the crowd cheered upon seeing him in his dark brown jodhpurs and brown suede jacket. If anyone had paid him any mind, they would have seen he had a parachute pack slung over his shoulder. When the Frenchmen pointed to the Junkers they had prepped for Julian, the Black Eagle hopped into the cockpit of the other. He would not allow himself to be sabotaged. He ignited the engine, eased back the throttle, checked the flaps, released the brake, and recited a short prayer before bringing the airplane up above the roaring crowd. He looped, spun, slid, and even managed to do several tight 8s. After 30 minutes of maneuvers, the Junkers was brought back down. Seeing the thousands in attendance thirsting for an encore, Julian signaled Maillet, who he saw tinkering on the other Junkers, possibly confirming his earlier suspicions, to ready for takeoff. Reluctantly, and due to not wanting to upset the Crown Prince, the Frenchman did as he was told, and together with Julian, soared back into the sky. The Black Eagle would parachute once again.
At the height of 5,000 feet, I jumped from the plane and tugged at my parachute. I floated down within 40 feet of the king, who, rushing across the field, embraced me and pinned upon my breast the Order of Menelik, the highest decoration which the kingdom awards. In addition, he presented me with $5,000 and created me a colonel.
Colonel Hubert Fauntleroy Julian, now a citizen of Ethiopia, became a regular sight to behold in Addis Ababa. His uniform, consisting of white jodhpurs, a blue tunic, tan pith helmet with the royal crest, and high leather boots, complemented his high-profile villa on the slope of Mountain Toto, where he would host elegant soirees. Beautiful women of the royal court became enamored of him, and opting not to hurt anyone's feelings, decided to make no mention of anyone named Essie. After 3 months, however, Julian began to feel homesick for America. He felt a responsibility to those back home across the Atlantic. They had, after all, been deprived of his presence and probably were yearning to discover what had become of their black eagle. Knowing he still had until November, when Tafari would be crowned emperor, Julian devised a plan and got it approved by the palace. He would return to the United States in order to build up awareness and possibly funds for the Ethiopia that Tafari wished to see be created.
With the dried skins of lions, which he says were shot by him, and other souvenirs, Colonel Julian sails on the Isle de France. He is full of enthusiasm for his adopted country and his emperor, who he says is a most remarkable man. Working from 6 in the morning until late into the night, supervising all details of the government himself. The Abyssinians, he says, are a very kindly and hospitable people. They welcome black men from all over the world who have the ability to do things for the preservation of the only black kingdom remaining in the world. The Pittsburgh Courier.
When he arrived back in New York City on July 30th, Julian was bombarded by reporters and photographers, even before he was able to leave the ship. His trip to Ethiopia piqued public interest at a time when most Americans had yet to even see their own Grand Canyon. When thinking of the shores of Africa, Henry Morton Stanley and Teddy Roosevelt were names that came to mind. Julian had crossed an ocean, a continent, and come back. His goal, as laid out to Rastafari, was to find blacks in America willing to relocate to Ethiopia and help bring it into the 20th century. So he set up a series of lectures in order to tell his tale and recruit. He spoke at places like the Holy Trinity Baptist Church in Brooklyn, where the Honorable George Stewart, a member of the New York legislature, referred to Julian as a messenger of peace and an ambassador of goodwill. But as he continued his lectures and touted himself a representative of the Ethiopian government, the crowds grew suspicious and began to dwindle. They failed to buy into the idea of a no white strings attached free all-black empire. When asked by James Cannon of the New York Telegram why his fellow blacks refused to embrace him the way the whites did to Lindbergh, Julian answered with, "No great man is honored by his own people. The pioneer is never acclaimed by his own hometown."
You know, this was still part of this whole colonial enterprise that was going on, and that all those things, I would say, conspired to create this idea of this place being something that he's saying we should go there, but you've got to be joking, right? That how can we go someplace that must be backwards? But he had seen something other than backwardsness.
When the press contacted the Ethiopian embassy to confirm Julian's actions, they had to ensure no one would look poorly upon their country due to Julian's overzealous nature.
Reports appearing in newspapers concerning the Abyssinian government are absolutely false and unauthorized. Hubert Julian is in no way representing the Abyssinian government or any department thereof. Mr. Julian had misused the kindness and opportunity the Abyssinian government offered him. Malaku E. Bayan.
Fearing he would lose out on the opportunities offered to him by Ethiopia, Julian cut his stay at home short. He kissed Essie goodbye and booked passage back to Europe in order to return to the African kingdom he felt would continue embracing him. Several reporters were waiting for him at the gangplank of the SS Europa.
The papers, even of my own race, have harassed and maligned me. They have treated me with absolute partiality. They have claimed I was soliciting funds for an air force, that I was buying bombs, that I will never make an ocean-crossing flight. They are all canards.
When Julian returned to Addis Ababa, Tafari sat him down and explained just how crucial his coronation was. Foreign dignitaries and heads of state would be in attendance. It was bad enough that the world saw Ethiopia as a backwards nation, and the soon-to-be emperor had no intention of allowing those feelings any validity. He believed that a showing of his people's ability to fly would be in order, and appointed the Black Eagle Air Marshal in charge of all planes and pilots. The job included taking command over a cadet training program started while Julian had been in America. If anyone thought that Julian would take his new position lightly, they were wrong. He took immediate charge of the cadets, drilling them from dawn to dusk, 7 days a week. Tafari, pleased with the progress he had been hearing about, sent a personal note to his new air marshal, telling him that a private dress rehearsal for the court was being arranged. Julian, the Crown Prince wrote, would sit at his side for consultation and program planning during the entire dry run. Julian was not happy about that last part. He believed it was his right to be able to showcase his own talents. On the morning of October 31st, 1930, Julian readied his men inside a newly constructed wooden hangar at the end of the dirt airstrip. He had them march out towards the tent where Tafari was waiting. The Emperor-elect stood and returned the salute his infant Air Force had given him. The men Julian had chosen boarded their Junkers and took off. They performed no tricks or stunts. Rather, they kept themselves leveled out and safe. The crowd applauded. But at this point, Tafari realized two things. Julian had never come to sit next to him, and he could not see his gypsy moth at its usual position at the end of the strip. The two French pilots, none too pleased to have been pushed aside in favor of Julian, pointed out to their employer the emergence of his favorite airplane having just exited the hangar and now roaring down the runway for takeoff. Dumbfounded, Tafari snapped forward in his throne, mouth agape as Julian ascended. No one had ever dared to so boldly disobey him. Unaware that this had not been planned by their ruler, the audience cheered their air marshal on.
Just because you can fly a type A does not necessarily mean you can jump in aircraft type B and then just take off and fly.
As he brought the gypsy moth around, Julian pulled back on the stick in order to level out. Nothing happened. He tried again, but still nothing. Just then, the engine began to sputter.
The controls had been tampered with, and it was impossible to maneuver the aircraft. It was a clear case of sabotage. I had no doubt that my French colleagues were at the bottom of it. Their jealousy and dislike of me had become even more violent and more open after the Emperor had praised and decorated me at the earlier show, and it was obvious to me that their bitterness had now led them into this terrible action.
Julian could do nothing but accept that the engine had stalled and a crash landing was inevitable. This would not be a soft landing. Spectators scattered. Tafari remained on his throne, frozen with rage. Julian did his best to bring the gypsy moth away from the royal tent, ultimately slamming it into a eucalyptus tree. Tafari cringed as he heard the sound of his favorite airplane's wings being torn off their body. No explosion followed. No fire was started. There was simply silence. A deathly quiet chill hung in the air.
Could have been the plane was poorly maintained, could have been a bad weather situation. I'm sure the airfield was terrible. We really don't know a lot about it, whether it was a pilot error. Maybe, probably not, because he had a fair degree of flying experience behind him at that time.
Colonel Hubert Fauntleroy Julian was metaphorically sitting on a wall like Humpty Dumpty, and he got a great fall in Addis Ababa. The Emperor did have one favorite airplane. The colonel took it without permission and wrecked it without hurting himself. He is disgraced. His orders and his uniforms and his silver spurs are taken from him. He is ordered out of the country. Moreover, the monarch had the contemptuous statement given out that Julian was in the habit of eating so much that it wouldn't pay to jail and feed him. Having no money, and having been before his naturalization in Ethiopia a British West Indian, Julian asked and got a visitor's visa to return to Harlem and secured from Americans money enough to pay his fare. His faith in America is unshaken. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle.
By the time Julian arrived back in the United States, Rastafari had been crowned Haile Selassie I. After the Ile-de-France steamed into its pier in New York City, reporters swarmed the Black Eagle as he posed for pictures while dressed in Homburg cutaway striped trousers, a winged collar under a long dark dress jacket, gray gloves, a derby, and in his hand a Malacca cane. He denied all reports coming in that claimed he had been banished by the Emperor, saying the two of them parted on the best of terms, and that he resigned his position for fear of losing his own life to more sabotage. He would not cower from being killed, but he preferred, as he put it, to die with his boots on. Some journalists did not buy into Julian's defense, and did what they could to discredit him, even insult his integrity.
It was difficult for me to get at the real truth of the affair, short of asking the foreign minister or the emperor himself. But I have good cause to believe that Julian was dismissed because of his swagger and his talkativeness. He spouted very much to the press on his first visit, and as the emperor receives all the clippings from all the papers over the world concerning Abyssinia, it was easy for him to understand what Julian had been doing. Julian had a splendid chance, as any young Negro of the present day could have had, but he threw it away because of his love for exhibition. I heard that he was in the habit of walking on streets with a whip, with which he would strike those of the humbler people who did not move out of his way fast enough. J.A. Rogers, the New York Amsterdam News.
The black newspapers have more perspective on what they're writing about, certainly closer to the subject matter, and probably did a better job of doing their job, which is to be skeptical, and are more qualified at this point to, recognize what's bullshit and what's not.
Julian, never one to allow bad press against him to go unaddressed, sat down with Floyd J. Calvin and gave the reporter his side.
Of course, it must be remembered that Mr. Rogers lives in Paris and must be careful to not offend the French or they will put him out. He said, I carried a whip and would whip people in the street. He did not explain that the man I whipped one day was a European and not an Abyssinian. And the reason I whipped him was because he had kicked an Abyssinian youth in my presence. The thing so angered me that I grabbed the whip from the hand of my interpreter and lashed him. And when the emperor heard about it, he was pleased. The fact that Mr. Rogers said he heard in Paris that I would not last long showed the French had it in for me.
The first 2 chapters of Julian's adventures in Ethiopia had been written, but the book was not ready to be closed. It would be less than half a decade's wait for the Black Eagle to return to that country, and in the intervening years, he found equally entertaining ventures to occupy himself with. The New York Journal American, one of the many publications owned by media mogul William Randolph Hearst, would not allow Julian a moment's rest. Articles appeared as quick as they could be typeset, lambasting the Black Eagle for his failures in both America as well as in Ethiopia. Expecting no reprisal from the subject of their intense scrutiny, the Journal American's executives found themselves dumbstruck when Julian took legal action against them.
The Hearst papers, which are noted for burlesquing the Negro, may have their attitude changed by the suit for $500,000 filed by Colonel Hubert Julian. There is no mistake about the New York Journal American doing what the colonel alleges. It is all in black and white and can't be recalled. When Colonel Julian returned from Abyssinia, even some Negroes attempted to poke fun at him. Now we see in him a man who speaks of a king as casually as we in this country refer to a mayor or a governor. We hope he will teach the white newspapers a lesson that will be of value to us all. Floyd J. Calvin, The Pittsburgh Courier.
At a time when government-sanctioned segregation was being implemented within the country, Hubert Julian, a celebrity known to all races, was suing one of the richest men in the United States. He would pull no punches nor let the color of his skin determine how he should proceed. To combat the claims by Hearst's writers that he was expelled by Haile Selassie in disgrace, Julian appealed to Addison E. Southard, the American Consul General at Addis Ababa, to receive the testimony of the emperor himself. It would take 2 years before the libel suit reached its conclusion. Julian dropped the case against the Journal American after signing a settlement purported to have been for $25,000, which his and Hearst's lawyers would not comment on. No retraction was ever printed, but no one could deny Julian the satisfaction he felt by going up against the media giant's company and walking away unscathed.
Of course, he was a black man, he was a Negro, but he was still a man. He did what he wanted to do for him. He may have been looked upon as a curiosity, as an exception to the rule at that time, considering people of color, but he still did what he did. People may not have liked him, maybe for his attitude or the color of his skin, but they respected him. And that's what he wanted, to be respected for what he did, for his achievements.
Some fans of Julian began to question his ability to pilot an airplane. The Journal American had tainted their opinions of the Black Eagle, and no lawsuit was going to help lessen their questioning. One piece written by Floyd J. Calvin, which supported Julian as an exceptional airman, was met with harsh criticism.
My dear Mr. Calvin, I know of several colored pilots here in the East and in Pittsburgh. Every one of them, I'd bet my last dollar, could fly Julian out of the sky. If your paper would look up some of these fellows who really have a right to wear a pair of wings and give them a little write-up once in a while, you'd be doing something credible. Let's hear less of this guy until he learns how to fly. Very truly yours, a courier reader and transport pilot.
Julian saw the writing on the wall. If he wanted to be seen as a flyer, then he would have to actually do some flying. Over that late summer, starting in Long Island, Julian began performing a series of exhibition flights for crowds numbering in the thousands. While not much stunting took place, he did complete a 23-minute solo flight, waving to the crowd as he landed. He knew, however, that in order to maintain a presence within the public's eye, there needed to be something more for them to watch. He caught wind of William J. Powell, founder of the Bessie Coleman Aero Club, and his all-black flying troupe known as the Five Blackbirds, who had just performed to a Labor Day audience of 15,000. Julian saw opportunity for his reputation to grow and his pockets to fill. After a brief correspondence, Julian joined Powell and his team, who consisted of Irwin Wells, W.B. Johnson, William Akins, and Marie Dickerson. That autumn, the Blackbirds, along with special guest Hubert Julian, performed in Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and Detroit. Julian handled some of the flying while the others wing-walked and dangled about on rope ladders hanging from landing carriages.
Aviation was new. It was something people hadn't seen before. And to go to someplace, see an air show where people would be doing all these death-defying stunts, and they certainly were because so many were killed during that period, it really did promote and popularize aviation.
Powell intended to bring the air circus to Southern California that winter. Julian extended his contract, and the two pooled funds in order to purchase a used Cadillac, intending to pile in the remaining Blackbirds and drive out to Los Angeles in order to keep the show going. They set out from St. Louis, made it to Oklahoma City, and proceeded on an all-night drive to the Texas border. Julian, not ignorant of the fact that they were 6 blacks in the American South, pulled the car over and changed into his old Ethiopian uniform, which he had been adorning during the troupe's exhibitions. Hungry and thirsty, the group pulled into a single gas pump service station, allured by the word "Eats" scrawled across the roadhouse's wooden exterior. As they stretched out their seat-sore limbs, a man's voice barked out, "What you damn niggers want here?" Julian, clasping his hands in a praying position and bowing, responded with, "I bring thee blessings from His Imperial Majesty, the African Emperor, who is my ruler." The proprietor of the establishment eyed the strange-looking black man with the odd accent. He shifted the toothpick from one side of his mouth to the other before calling out to his wife and 3 children, "Hey, these ain't no field niggers, they're African princes." The 6 aviators ate their breakfast, gassed up their car, and drove on, Julian chuckling in contrast to the still dumbstruck faces of his peers. News that the 5 Blackbirds and the Black Eagle coming to perform was being received with great enthusiasm. There were newspaper reports, leaflets being circulated, and at least one enormous billboard advertisement had been purchased for spreading the word. When the troupe arrived, they took part in a motorcycle parade through the downtown business district of Los Angeles and were met by Mayor John C. Porter. Esquire claimed that it was the first time a Negro had been received by the mayor on the steps of City Hall. What had been clearly made known back during the performances in Pittsburgh was only strengthened in Los Angeles. Julian and Powell, based on reputations alone, were the main attractions of the show. The former, however, who was supposed to perform a triple parachute jump which consisted of several free falls in between 3 chute openings, did not live up to the build-up, executing only a standard jump. When it was time for Powell and his Blackbirds, they performed "Follow the Leader," as Dickerson would recall. Powell would lead. The first one would fall off, then the second one, then the third one, and we would make a line and come on back around and make another string and come off. The crowd loved them. There was one piece of advertising preceding the exhibition, however, which left Powell scratching his head.
It is announced that Lieutenant Powell, piloting an autogyro, will perform a 5,000-foot descent race with another autogyro, piloted by Colonel Julian, in which the loser wins. Another feature of the air circus will be the race between Colonel Julian in parachute and Lieutenant Powell in an autogyro. These 2 flyers are making plans now for a transatlantic flight this summer. The San Bernardino County Sun.
While Julian had been quietly hinting at a globe-crossing attempt via the sky, the cat was out of the bag now. Powell, surprised as anyone else, did not dismiss the announcement. Rather, he engaged in a series of talks with the Black Eagle regarding what the latter had in mind. The 2 traveled south together in order for Julian to engage the curious press in his own style of self-promotion. If someone could rid Julian of his spasmodic outbursts of egotism, Powell would later write, there could hardly be a speaker found to excel him.
Colonel Julian said he came to San Diego for good luck on his proposed transatlantic flight because it was from here that many of the world's great distance flights started and were successful. I just want to absorb a little of Lindbergh's luck, he said. The flight from New York to India will be made in a special Balanka plane. The only cargo to be carried on the hop to Delhi besides Powell, who will act as navigator, will be a bale of cheesecloth, which will be presented to Mahatma Gandhi. The Chicago Defender.
Julian kept up selling this flight for over a year, losing Powell along the way to sheer frustration on the navigator's part. But Julian did not let that stop him from soliciting funds and bringing the Balanka plane to Floyd Bennett Airport in Brooklyn for its official christening ceremony. Funds trickled in slowly with no sign of improving, so Julian traveled to Boston for a series of short flights and lectures.
He was always going to fly someplace. He was always on this impending trip someplace. So what he would do, he would go from city to city, town to town, and blacks were so happy to have a hero of any type, much less after Bessie Coleman died. They wouldn't know that Julian just left and collected $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 from this black church or this black group over here in town A, and now he's in town B doing the same thing, and he just kept going around and around and around.
When he returned to New York, a banquet was set for him at the Harlem YMCA, attended by several important personalities within the realms of aviation, law, and politics. What was absent, however, was the general public, those who Julian had for 10 years been trying to rally in support of his desire to fly for his race.
I have no explanation to offer for Harlem's lack of appreciation of Colonel Julian and his efforts to make a contribution to the field of aviation. There surely must be some reward for an individual who possesses the perseverance exhibited by this character. If renowned aviators, if builders and users of the world's best airplanes believe in him, why shouldn't we? If and when he makes this flight, and it is a success, we'll want to be known as his friends. Thelma Burlack Boozer, the New York Amsterdam News.
When the operation folded in late 1933, the Black Eagle realized that the public was no longer interested in funding flights of fancy just a few years after they had salivated over such endeavors. The world had changed, and Julian would have to find ways to satisfy his need to fly, promote aviation, and keep himself and his family out of the poorhouse.
Harlem had its own Easter parade. It was a sinuous, brilliant procession of hundreds of chanting followers of the Reverend M.J. Devine, who is father to thousands of Negroes in a series of kingdoms throughout the metropolitan area. The swaying ranks were viewed by thousands along the route, and by the father himself and his staff in a red monoplane. The New York Times.
Although he had piloted the airplane and appeared on the platform once it had landed, and Father Devine addressed the crowd, Julian was not a follower of the Reverend. He saw work without prejudice and picked up what he could. But when the opportunity to escort Mrs. Amy Garvey to London came along, Julian was on the SS Europa, setting sail in late July 1934. A little over a month into their trip, Mrs. Garvey played hostess to Nana Sir Ofori Atta I, King of Akiem Abuakwa, one of the largest and wealthiest kingdoms of the then Gold Coast colony.
I had hired a plane. Sir Nana asked if I could take him up for a joyride, as he had never been in an aeroplane, and together we walked over to where the plane was parked. It was a warm day, and Sir Nana was attended by his ritual umbrella bearer, who held an ornate, gaily colored parasol over his master's head. Under my directions, the paramount chief got into the second seat of the plane and strapped himself in. Then I got into the cockpit. I gunned the engine. The tremendous and unexpected gust of air from the propeller caught the wide umbrella as the bearer struggled for a footing on the plane. Clinging hold for dear life, away went the bearer at the end of the umbrella, sailing across the tarmac with his robes billowing about him.
When Julian arrived back in New York in December, he brought with him the story of him narrowly escaping death during a nighttime flight above the English Channel. By his account, and that published in the British and French newspapers, he had taken off from Le Bourget Field in France, intent on making an engagement scheduled that night in London, when a terrible storm broke out. He landed by the lights of car headlights, his plane in shambles, but physically unscathed. This was just the type of tale the American public had been without for the duration of his absence. But the Black Eagle was bored. He was bored with the way his life was going. Essie and Olga brought him happiness at home, but this was a man who could not sit idle, letting the world pass him by. And as 1935 rolled around, it was becoming clear that he had found a new call to adventure. The Italian military mobilization had not happened overnight. Benito Mussolini's desire to take Eastern Africa had been watched by the global community, yet he had been allowed to continue his operations. Julian's blood was brought to a boil when Haile Selassie's kingdom entered into the crosshairs of fascist Italy's plans for conquest.
Another important thing to keep in mind is how intense the reaction of the African American population was when the Italians invaded, in large part because Ethiopia was this symbol of black freedom, but also of black antiquity.
On February 22nd, the day after he set sail for Europe en route to Ethiopia, the Chicago Tribune cautioned, "Il Duce note, Black Eagle sails for Abyssinia." Maybe it was because he had been barred from joining the fight in World War I by his father that Hubert Julian went back to Ethiopia. His courage cannot come under question, but his common sense leaves room for criticism. The country he was returning to stood little chance against the Italians this time, who thirsted for vengeance after their humiliating defeat in the First Italo-Ethiopian War in 1896. Julian's combination of nerve, stupidity, and that adventure-seeking drive led him back to the East African kingdom, arriving there on April 12, 1935, having managed to join up with a weapons shipment consisting of 20,000 rifles, 1,000 machine guns, and 12 million rounds of ammunition, sent from sympathetic European nations.
The arrival of this huge consignment of arms and munitions does two things. It definitely points out the part Colonel Julian will play in the forthcoming conflict, and it announces to the world that Ethiopia is ready to defend her lands and her independence. The defiant attitude of Ethiopia shows Mussolini that he has invited more than he can handle at this time. The Chicago Defender.
Certainly some appeals were made after or at the start of the conflicts with Italy on the part of Haile Selassie to the League of Nations for some sort of assistance, which of course was not forthcoming, which to at least certain African Americans was seen as part of kind of a larger white conspiracy.
Julian, having come into the country illegally, sought an audience with Haile Selassie immediately. But the emperor was not interested. His chamberlain sending word to Julian that Ethiopia's aeronautical branch of the military, which was very small, was in the competent hands of the two French pilots. For 2 long months, Julian tried to gain access to the palace. And then when he did get in, it was done in the style that the Black Eagle was best known for. He put on his old uniform, marched directly to the gates, and demanded to see the chamberlain, telling him to inform the emperor that he was not there for pleasure, but to fight for him. 2 days later, a note arrived for him at the hotel he had been living in. Selassie thanked Julian for having come, reaffirmed his Ethiopian citizenship, and while making it clear that he would not have anything to do with the Air Force, enlisted him into the army as commanding officer of a new infantry detachment.
I replied that I had no military experience, but I was sure I had sufficient knowledge to instill discipline and the rudiments of warfare into these recruits. But these men had absolutely no idea of anything, so it was not difficult to teach them to form up, turn left or right or halt at the word of command. At least I ensured that they would not be an undisciplined rabble if it did come to fighting.
Men from all over the country flocked daily to Addis Ababa in order to join in the war effort. Julian, in full colonel-designated attire, continued to work on his infantrymen, training them to crawl under barbed wire, dig trenches, and fortify them, fight in hand-to-hand combat, and touch their toes without bending their knees. He could often be seen in the capital's central square, drilling his soldiers and shouting the ancient war cry of Ibalgum, which translated roughly to "mow the enemy down." On August 5th, Julian sent a cable to the Pittsburgh Courier explaining the atmosphere of impending battle which hovered over Ethiopia.
Intense excitement prevailing among foreigners and natives here as Ethiopia prepares steadily for war. Stop. Uncertainty about League of Nations decision causes mobilization to continue. Stop. Ethiopians calmly preparing for war next month, which they feel is inevitable. Stop. Patriotism at fever heat, and Ethiopia is ready. Stop. Military plans cloaked in secrecy, but American Negroes can feel assured that unpleasant surprises awaiting invading army. Stop.
He's giving tips to all these correspondents who've showed up. These Western writers and journalists have come to cover it and are basically having a great time. It's a bit of an adventure for them. And they need information, and Julian recognizes that and plays them against each other. I don't really see it in a nefarious way. He wants to be involved. He wants to be the guy who knows things. He's not flying anymore. He's been sort of marginalized. Nobody knows what's going on. He's probably an irresistible source. He's probably very quotable, saying very colorful things. He knows the emperor. He's color. He's copy.
3 days after sending that message, Julian would have his own unpleasant surprise. He was not the only foreigner volunteering his services to Haile Selassie's defense. Among several prominent Americans there in the country was John Charles Robinson, an aviator who called himself the Brown Condor of Chicago, a moniker Julian was quick to note had been plagiarized straight from the Black Eagle of Harlem. Robinson, a native of Florida, but who eventually made his base of operations in Chicago, had graduated from the Tuskegee Institute, having majored in automotive mechanics. Barred from attending the Curtis Wright Aviation School, he took on the job of night janitor, sweeping and dusting in the back of the classrooms, listening and learning as the teachers lectured. After his employers became aware of their janitor's intelligence and skills, they admitted him into the program, eventually hiring him as the first black instructor. Prior to leaving the United States and in honor of his 10-year anniversary of graduation, he landed a small plane in a field at Tuskegee in an attempt to get the Institute to begin an aeronautics program. And Robinson had been invited to Ethiopia by the emperor, whereas Julian received retroactive acceptance. The Brown Condor came in April of that year and had been asked to train pilots. The two had appeared together at air shows back in the United States and were on cordial terms with one another, boarding at the same establishment in Addis Ababa, the Hotel de France. While Julian could tolerate his counterpart's nickname to a point, he could not tolerate what he read in newspaper articles sent to him by Essie. Robinson, while not named directly, was believed to be the source of jabs against Julian in the press, questioning the Black Eagle's credentials and intentions. At the hotel's restaurant, Julian confronted Robinson. Witnesses say their words were brief before they came to blows, throwing punches and tossing one another over tables. Robinson then pulled a knife out, slashing his opponent across the arm, keeping him at a distance. Julian grabbed a wooden chair, charged and cracked Robinson across the head, laying him out onto the floor. With the news that more Italian troops were amassing at the borders, the palace, having no patience for dramatics, responded immediately, suspending Julian and promoting Robinson to commander of the Ethiopian Air Force. The former was enraged and voiced his disapproval to the New York Times.
The Ethiopian Air Force has been totally mismanaged. There are 12 planes in the country, of which 5 are unable to take to the air, and the other 7 are only capable of flying a few score miles. The personnel is chosen from the most inefficient quarters. If Addis Ababa is raided by the Italians, the Ethiopian Air Force can do nothing to defend the capital, nor can it carry out any reconnaissance flights over the Italian lines. Indeed, if war breaks out, it will not be surprising if certain leading foreign instructors immediately leave the country.
Julian would not be expelled from Ethiopia. Rather, he was gotten rid of under the pretense of being given command of a garrison in Ambo, a town about 90 miles from Addis Ababa near Lake Tana. Ambo was home to a few thousand people, the majority of them living in shacks typical of the rural areas. It also did not help that the troops waiting for him there were a motley crew, undersupplied and lacking formal military training. It did not take him long to understand just how angry the emperor had been, but his time in Ambo would be short. On October 3rd, 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia, crossing the Mareb River between Haile Selassie's kingdom and Eritrea. The Second Italo-Ethiopian War had begun. 7 days later, Julian arrived back in Addis Ababa on a foaming horse he had ridden the entire 90 miles. The next day, he headed for the front lines in Adawa with Minister of War Ras Mulugeta. Upon reaching their destination, it was clear that the conditions had fallen into chaos. There was no mechanized transport. Supplies were nearly non-existent. The soldiers were in a state of shock, as they had never before encountered the technological horrors of modern warfare. As heavy artillery fell upon them, many fled. Mulugeta ordered Julian back to the capital, hoping that if they had time to fortify it, that they might be ready for one last-ditch effort of defense. When Julian reached Addis Ababa, however, he was brought by a palace guard to the chamberlain, asking him to explain the rumor that the Italians had paid off an American in Ethiopia to assassinate the emperor. This bit of gossip had originated in Rome's leading daily, La Tribuna, and no doubt was run in order to cause a shake-up for the Ethiopian government. Julian became enraged by the accusation placed against him. One main point of contention was the fact that he was not actually an American citizen. He had had enough of being treated for less than what he believed he was worth.
Julian was bigger than life. That stands out. He was bigger than life. Julian was brave. Julian was a very healthy man. Julian was very quick on his feet. Julian was quite talkative. So saying that, I think the main reason Julian left was because the war was getting a bit too hot for him.
After submitting his formal resignation, the Black Eagle left Ethiopia on November 15th, and unfortunately for the kingdom and its subjects, Haile Selassie would leave as well 6 months later in May 1936, riding atop a donkey, preparing for a life in exile. Italy had won.
Italy will take over Ethiopia, and it will be a good thing. I'm disgusted, and I'll never go back. The country is an awful place. The emperor himself is an honorable person and doing everything he can for his country. But he is surrounded by some terrible people. I'm giving up my citizenship.
After securing safe passage out of Ethiopia, Julian arrived in Djibouti with little money, but somehow booked passage aboard the Compagnie. While docked at Port Said, he sold his camera for extra spending funds.
He apparently recognizes that the Ethiopians have no chance, and so he leaves the country. But he stops in England and makes a newsreel in which he appeals to the world to do something about this conflict.
After 9 months' service in Abyssinia, Colonel Julian is passing through London on his way to the United States.
I have just returned from Ethiopia, where I was chief instructor in the Emperor's army. Because of my knowledge of the condition there, I appeal to the world to assist in the settlement of this conflict between Italy and Ethiopia without causing a war between the great nations of the world.
And then, not so long afterwards, he starts to badmouth the Ethiopians.
He eventually landed in France and took up residence at a Parisian hotel, where he let his frustrations about what had transpired around him for 7 months come pouring out. His verbal lashings of the Ethiopian people did not sit well with the press or public. The Black Eagle became a target of harsh criticism.
Julian's record, as far as I can gather, while distinctly lacking in achievement, has been notoriously brilliant. Julian likes publicity, and this he gets at anybody's expense, even at the expense of his race as a whole. Ebenezer Ray, The New York Age.
When Julian arrived back in New York, reporters stormed the decks of the Aquitania, bombarding the Black Eagle with questions on his new attitudes towards Ethiopia and on where his next adventures might bring him. But Julian, attired in black coat and derby hat, swinging an ivory-capped ebony cane, continued on with the rhetoric he had started in Europe, saying that the Ethiopians cared not for black Americans and that the latter should stay out of international affairs.
Yes, indeed, New Year resolutions are fine things. Much more interesting might be a list of some of the resolutions that were not made with reasons. For instance, for 1936, I did not resolve to cultivate a liking for Hubert Julian because, as an example of the Negro, he typifies with exceptional clarity all of those characteristics which we could well do without. And, in my opinion, the race could just as easily do without him. St. Clair born, The New York Age.
Shortly after the start of 1936, Julian suddenly and uncharacteristically without pomp left again for Europe. A report soon emerged that he had gone to Paris in order to speak with the Italian consul located there. Rumors swirled now, laying claim that a deal had been struck between Julian and the Italians while he was in Djibouti, securing himself safe passage out of the country in exchange for insider information regarding the inner workings of Ethiopia. Julian was not out of the country for long, but his re-entrance into the United States on January 22nd would not prove easy. Upon arrival at Ellis Island, authorities detained him, claiming he did not have the proper paperwork. At the heart of the issue was Julian's citizenship. He had possessed a British passport, yet he had just recently been holding an Ethiopian one, which he renounced quite publicly. Facing deportation, he appealed to the State Department and remained on the island in a detention area for several days before word came from Washington allowing him back in, provided he get his papers in order and clear up the question of his citizenship.
I think the man without a country idea is a narrative that he would have enjoyed. Take citizenship, renounce citizenship, call yourself this, call yourself that. You can't be surprised when you're getting detained left, right, and center. If he's not getting detained and searched, we're never hearing about him, and you know he wants to be heard and read about.
When grilled by the media about his actions and the rumors of his cooperating with the Italians, Julian promised to eventually clear up everything during a series of lectures which would begin in Chicago, coinciding with the meeting of the National Negro Congress, where he intended to make a showing.
Momentary disturbance of the remarkable orderliness which characterized all of the sessions of the National Negro Congress was when Hubert Fauntleroy Julian, noticed strutting about the hall brilliantly attired and wearing a delegate's badge, was asked for his credentials. His reply was deemed unsatisfactory, but when asked to leave, he showed reluctance, whereupon 3 husky delegates are said to have seized him. Rescued by police from the angry mob, which quickly gathered, Julian was, with difficulty, rushed to a side room and escorted from the armory. The New York Age.
Laying low for the remainder of the winter, Julian gave no interviews or made any public appearances. Then in late spring, less than a month after Ethiopia admitted defeat, the Black Eagle set sail aboard the Italian liner Vulcania, bound for Rome. His behavior upon disembarking in Naples caused alarm as he declared Italy his new country, citing its victory in East Africa, announced a flight centered on Rome, and made a change in his name to Hubert Fauntleroy Julian.
We have been forced to hear Julian's idle prattings about his mythical exploits and extraordinary plans until we are sick of them. In fact, we are heartily sick of Julian and have been for a long time. We would like nothing better than for him to start off on that proposed hop, because we don't believe he can make it. And if he didn't, so much the better. The New York Age.
No one could argue with sentiments such as those. Julian had turned against everything he stood for and was now in the enemy's camp. But those who knew him, the real man behind the persona he had created for the public, were apt to believe there was something brewing secretly in the Black Eagle's dealings.
This happened so long ago, one really can't understand what was going on through my father's mind, if he was trying to wade political waters, if he was trying to play both sides of the fence. Who knows what his motives were for what he said, but they were his motives. He knew what he was doing regardless.
The story, never made public until the publication of his autobiography in 1964, detailed a plot straight out of an Ian Fleming novel. Julian had seemingly abandoned the Ethiopian cause in an attempt to gain Italian trust in order to assassinate Benito Mussolini.
On the day of the audience with Il Duce, I dressed even more carefully than usual. I strapped a tiny revolver to the inside of my right wrist, concealed by the sleeve of my jacket. If I suddenly extended the arm, whoever I pointed at would have the bullet delivered to him. If I lost my life, well, I should consider it well spent. Count Ciano, son-in-law of the dictator, began to blackguard Haile Selassie. I was unable to contain myself and began arguing with him and giving vent to all the feelings which had been bottled up inside me for so long.
With suspicion stirred, the meeting was canceled and Julian quickly retreated to his hotel, unstrapped the pistol from his arm, packed, and hopped onto the first train going north. The truth to this story is, of course, up for questioning. Yet it provides the only explanation for Julian's actions over the course of the winter and spring of 1936. If even a grain of this tale of would-be assassination is true, then the Black Eagle should have been lauded as a hero for his covert attempts at taking out the leader of fascist Italy. Suspect are his efforts to conceal this part of his life until nearly 3 decades later, but perhaps beneath all that desire for the headlines, Julian had some modesty, especially given the fact that nothing came of this one-man plot.
Do I believe it? Not really, but given how remarkable and how crazy a lot of Julian's lives and exploits were, maybe simply because it does explain his otherwise inexplicable behavior.
Several years, along with a few quirky endeavors, needed to pass before Julian was to regain credibility, but it would now be mixed with remnants of the criticisms he received for leaving Ethiopia and for the words said against the fallen kingdom. But the man had the thick skin needed for enduring such disparaging attacks against him. The Black Eagle would, despite it all, find a way to prevail.
Know that Chinese Mandarin at the right? Looks like Chiang Hu Fao Ju, a nearby pen pusher mutters. In Harlemese, he is just Hubert Fauntleroy Julian. Now he is looking Chinaward to beat the stuffings out of Japan. You can't keep Harlem's playboy put. Today he's an American, yesterday a British West Indian, the day before a strutting Ethiopian, next a subject of His Italian Majesty. Tomorrow, ladies and gentlemen, a Chinese chop suey. The New York Amsterdam News.
Julian had heard that the Chinese had sent a group to the United States seeking to buy airplanes. Making contact with them, he introduced the group to Belanca, helping to broker a deal between the two parties. Hoping to see the shipment all the way to the Far East, the Black Eagle sailed to France in order to begin the long journey. While in his hotel room in Normandy, however, a chair collapsed from under him, sending Julian to the ground and later to the hospital. It would take 6 weeks at minimum for the 3 fractures in his arm to fully heal, causing him to miss the opportunity which the press had poked fun at.
You know, a lot of people say he's a charlatan. I just think that's too simple. To remember he's West Indian also, he's from Trinidad, and there's this tradition of the Trinidadian smart man, which is someone who's a bit too clever, possibly a bit of a criminal, but is also greatly admired in the society for being so clever and getting over on everyone. Maybe get away with something is seen as admirable as long as nobody really gets hurt.
I tried out my tricks, first of all, in the street, swallowing many glasses of water, and then pouring forth a great fountain from one side of the road to the other. A cafe proprietor saw me doing this one day and chased me down the street. I thought he wanted to beat me up, but no. All he did was put a coin in my hand and asked me to repeat the trick. Prince Haji Ali.
Billed sometimes as the great Egyptian miracle man, the amazing regurgitator, and the human aquarium, Ali was Prince only when performing. Described as Judy Garland's favorite vaudevillian, Ali had been performing in the United States since the mid-1920s, accompanied by his daughter Almina, billed as the Princess. When he died on November 5, 1937 in the United Kingdom, Julian, a friend and admirer, hoped to sell Ali's body to Johns Hopkins University, sharing the profits with Almina. They arrived in New York in early December, garnering much attention and jeering as the now monocle-sporting Julian, despite Ali's many American performances, tried to paint the dead man as a true prince, he and his daughter being the descendants of King Tut himself.
The legions of France are on the march, and side by side with their French comrades are many black men. Everywhere you turn, you'll see nothing but soldiers, and in every branch, blacks are well represented. France does not wait until an emergency arises to prepare her black citizen, as is the case in America. They are chiefly in the departments of artillery and aviation, although infantrymen there are in plenty. Paris is completely blacked. All neon signs and shop windows are turned off at night. The same applies to motor vehicles. September 9th, 1939.
Julian had crossed the Atlantic, traveling under a League of Nations issued Nansen passport he'd managed to obtain under the argument of having no legal citizenship of any country, and settled in as special war correspondent for the New York Amsterdam News. His stint, however, would be brief, lasting only a month before he packed up and left.
After the none too credible reputation of the aviator had been recounted by a couple of his paper's contemporaries, it was noticed that his name was omitted from the Amsterdam's columns, like so much libel. Now the good-for-nothing comes back to the U.S. This his paper publishes, but without even passing mention that less than a month ago he was flaunted as its war correspondent. The newspaper evidently assumes that its readers have forgotten. If we were a publisher of a newspaper, we might do as blundering a job as some of the current Negro publishers. But about one thing we are sure, we couldn't do worse. Ebenezer Ray, The New York Age.
By December 1939, Father Divine, Julian's past employer from several years back, found himself sitting in a courtroom with 2 former angels, as his followers were referred to by Thomas and Verinda Brown, suing him for the return of their savings and property which they claimed had been coerced away from them by the Reverend in 1930, when they felt compelled to relocate to Sayville, Long Island, living in one of his heavens, as they were called, indulging in hours-long feasts. Now, out from under Divine's influence, the Browns were facing their former leader, he being surrounded by current notebook-holding angels ready to scribble down anything he said, for his words to them were sacred. Julian, magnificently garbed, burst into the courtroom, declaring that he would help settle the matter out of court, which Father Divine was not keen on doing, producing $12,000 in warehouse receipts for whiskey. Justice Benedict E. Deneen was impressed enough to adjourn the proceedings while counsels for both sides could confer.
I am not a follower of Father Divine, but I am a Negro, and I have seen the good things he has done. Any man who can make great numbers of people quit drinking and smoking, and even make thieves return the things they have stolen, I am for. I am sick and tired of seeing the Negro race kicked around. Because I am a Negro, I want to do my bit to help demonstrate its true dignity.
Behind-the-scenes conferences began, with Julian taking an unusual commanding role, but ultimately the Black Eagle would have to admit defeat. Once he began receiving phone calls from 20 other former angels, all demanding retribution, it was clear that the previously proposed settlement sum of $12,000 would now be more like $50,000, a total Julian declared was out of the question. The trial would proceed, but Father Divine ended up settling the case out of court and out of his own pocket.
Images are important, and they do have an impact. Now, they can be used just for personal promotion, or they can be used to promote other causes. And where we come down on Julian, was he altruistic or was he totally selfish? He was certainly someone who created images for himself and who exploited those images to his advantage.
On January 15, 1940, the famous black filmmaker Oscar Michaud premiered the notorious Eleanor Lee at the RKO Regent Theater in Harlem, and Hubert Julian, credited as an associate producer for contributing funds to marketing the movie after Michaud completed it, made the screening an event worthy of Hollywood. The two men had bonded over a similar desire to forward the cause of equality.
My results might have been narrow at times, due perhaps to certain limited situations which I endeavored to portray, but in those limited situations, the truth was the predominant characteristic. It is only by presenting those portions of the race portrayed in my pictures in the lightened background of their true state that we can raise our people to greater heights. I am too imbued with the spirit of Booker T. Washington to engraft false virtues upon ourselves, to make ourselves that which we are not. Oscar Michaud.
Stepping out of a Cadillac, in full dress with a shining top hat, white silk gloves, and an Inverness cape, Julian went straight to theater manager Max Mink's office, preparing the numerous bottles of scotch and champagne for the invited guests. As 9 o'clock struck, guests arrived, golden invitations in their hands. Julian and Michaud greeted each person one by one, the filmmaker answering questions in passing, saying how they shot the movie in 10 days at the old Biograph studios in the Bronx. Once everyone was seated, Julian cried out, "Darken the theater, and on with the show. Let joy be unconfirmed."
We sat through this drama, and at last the notorious Eleanor Lee was unfolded before us. It was colossal. I remember that there was a man named Stacker Lee who was tried for murder, and the star witness for the prosecution was a parrot. The parrot had been an eyewitness to the crime, and during the trial kept testifying, "Stacker, you done it. Stacker, you stabbed him with a knife." Stacker Lee was Eleanor Lee's papa, and the way Eleanor Lee got notorious was in Paducah, where she was in the lowdown business before she went to St. Louis. It was very gripping and held the interest, and I laughed until I got a pain in my side. H. Allen Smith.
Upon exiting the theater, Smith inquired when the film would be shown again. The usher looked at him saying, "Well, what do you mean, again? It's been showing all day since 11 o'clock this morning." This 9 o'clock show was the only one that's the world's premiere. The journalist, grinning after a short mental lapse, remembered that only the Black Eagle of Harlem could have orchestrated such an affair.
Russian troops, dropped by parachutes from huge bombing planes, were reported to have occupied Petsamo, Finland's chief port on the Arctic Ocean, today, following bombing raids which left the port and another town in flames. Violent fighting between the Finnish and Russian forces was reported. Despite machine gunning from low-flying airplanes, 600 refugees crossed the frontier. Crowds of women and children were seen on roads leading to the border as Soviet planes roared overhead. The Nashua Telegraph.
The Winter War, as it would come to be called, started on November 30th, 1939, when the Soviet Union invaded Finland, sparking a conflict that lasted 105 days with casualties reaching as high as 360,000 for the Russians and 70,000 for the Finns. The League of Nations deemed the attack illegal and expelled the Soviet Union from its ranks. The conflict ended on March 12, 1940, with the signing of the Moscow Peace Treaty, which saw Finland maintain its independence but cede territory to the Soviet Union. Before the fighting ceased, however, Julian had contacted the Finnish embassy in Washington, D.C., offering his service as an airman in the fight against communist aggression. He set sail, like many other American volunteers, for Finland, ready to do what he could to assist.
My only regret is that the hostilities ended before I got over there. My assignment as an instructor in the Finnish Air Corps only goes to prove that we as Negroes must be prepared, for we never know when opportunity may come knocking at our door. The Negro may not be given an opportunity in the United States, but if he is qualified, there are all sorts of avenues open to him outside.
The assorted array of airplanes from the British, French, Italians, Swedes, and Americans proved to be enough for the Finns, as they were able to combat the Russian forces which outnumbered them. But it was probably the foresight of its government that made Finland bring in people like Julian, who despite his overall lack of formal training, knew how to rally those around him. Knowing that the Soviet Union's agreed upon peace treaty with them was nothing that would stand the test of time, the Finns wanted to do what they could in order to strengthen their aeronautical arsenal. Julian's time in the northern country was brief. He stayed about 3 months in total, but experienced a warm welcome. He described the people of Helsinki, Finland's capital, as rather gay, though it was perhaps the rather hectic gaiety of people living on the edge of the abyss. Given the rank of captain and attached to the staff of General Jarl Lundqvist, commander of the Finnish Air Force in his capacity, Julian would pilot the general from one base to another.
If he could simply get himself to a place like Finland, that it's much easier for him to distinguish himself by doing something like that, to have an impact simply by getting himself there, getting himself into the newspapers, then he can really do something notable, or perhaps more importantly, that the press perceives as notable.
Had it not been for one incident, Julian's stay would have been deemed uneventful. But the Black Eagle found himself out on a rescue mission one day to retrieve a fellow American volunteer, Lieutenant Lewis Horton Peters, whose plane had gone down during a routine scouting mission.
I walked over and found that Peters had slipped while getting out of his aircraft, fallen on the ice, and broken his ankle. So naturally, I went to pick him up and carry him over to our own plane. But he wouldn't have it. I be damned if I let a nigger rescue me, he said. So, without saying a word, I went over to him, bent down, and pulled off his flying boots and thick woolen stockings, then started walking away. "Hey, where you going?" he yelled. "Right now," I replied, "I'm going back to the base. When I remember, I might suggest someone else comes out and pick you up. Unless, of course, you feel like apologizing." He swore, but there was nothing else he could do but say he was sorry. So I went back and carried him over to our plane. "Just remember," I said, "that this is Finland and not Texas."
Lack of education and a lack of desire for one had kept millions of my people in ignorance concerning the capabilities of colored citizens. Captain Julian treated the American boys so well. He invited me to dinner once or twice, and then I began to wonder about what a fool I'd been. If the colored people had 15 or 20 men like Captain Julian to act as ambassadors of goodwill, it wouldn't be long before a lot of other white people would start thinking like me. They discriminate because they just don't know. From now on, I'm going to do all I can to help get colored aviators into the U.S. Army and Navy. Lieutenant Lewis Horton Peters.
With little more to be accomplished in Finland, Julian, along with 100 or so American volunteers, boarded the Matilda Thornton and arrived back in New York on July 3, 1940. The ship had been overcrowded, and many of the men slept in hammocks in the cargo hold for the 13-day sailing, wearing stitched-together clothing from their tattered uniforms and cloth given to them by the Finnish civilians before departing. Julian, on the other hand, appeared refreshed and garbed in a sky blue uniform with 3 captain stars on the epaulets. He had rested easy in his own private cabin.
I see Julian as Julian. I see Julian looking out for Julian. I see Julian wanting what Julian wanted. I see Julian getting what Julian wanted. I do not see him by any means as trying to go from poor to rich for the sake of lifting anyone up other than Julian. I see Julian as a true thrill seeker.
As reporters flocked around the homecoming volunteers, Captain Albert Ito, a Finnish naval officer, and Captain Albert Stenberg, a recruitment officer for Canada and the United States, lambasted Julian for wearing a uniform he did not earn or deserve. The Black Eagle, ever prepared, retaliated with a document bearing the signature of Baron Gustav Mannerheim, Chief of Defense of the Finnish Defense Forces, authenticating his role as a military attaché. If you were a gentleman, Ito insisted, you would take off that uniform. Julian, infuriated, waved off his critics and took his leave. He would not stand around and be accused of lacking civility. On September 13, 1940, Julian dined with Giuseppe Bellanca at the Waldorf Astoria. As their conversation turned to the war in Europe, now a year old, Bellanca mentioned he had read Adolf Hitler's manifesto Mein Kampf, finding it appalling for, among many reasons, the way in which the German Chancellor viewed blacks and Jews. Julian confessed his ignorance of the book, and Bellanca went on to explain how Hermann Goering, Minister of Aviation for the Third Reich, shared his leader's opinion that blacks were baboons, or at the very least, half-apes, unfit to associate with humans. Julian, who did not share the view of American isolationism and hoped his country of residence would take up arms against Nazi Germany, became enraged. Having just recently returned from Finland and seeing the aftermath of totalitarian aggression, he sent off a cable addressed to Goering via the German embassy. It was soon picked up by the newspapers.
As pioneer aviator and aeronautical representative of millions of intrepid and cultured Negroes of the world, we resent emphatically and without compromise dastardly insult as expressed by the Chancellor of the Reich, that all Negroes of American and British Empire are half-apes and baboons and should be incarcerated in a special camp. I therefore challenge and defy you, Hermann Goering, as head of the Nazi Air Force, to meet me, Hubert Fauntleroy Julian, at 10,000 feet above the English Channel to fight an aerial duel, to avenge this cowardly insult to the honor of my race 30 days from date, with neutral correspondents as referees.
The staff of the German embassy told Julian that should Goering give him the time of day and accept such an outlandish threat, that the Black Eagle should paint a big black baboon on the side of his plane. Julian told them their minister should match his baboon with a fat pink pig. Julian's mailbox became flooded with hundreds of letters from enthusiastic blacks, again rallying behind the colonel for his desire to fight yet another group espousing prejudice against them. One man, a mechanic from Nashville, Tennessee, requested Julian to accept him into his ranks.
While looking over the evening papers, I noticed the remarks attributed to this Goering. It made my blood boil. And feeling the same as you do, I am willing to give my life along with you to defend the honor of our race. I have a wife and 1 child, but they're not apes. If you will accept me to do the machine gunning, I am ready to come to New York right away. Ernest Dixon, Jr.
Roy Wilkins, in his column for the New York Amsterdam News, praised Julian for his vigor and courage, writing that we colored Americans would be much the worse off for his absence, and that his flourishing threats are like a cool, refreshing shower in this sultry, hateful world.
It took that type of belief in self and belief in spirit to overcome the things that other people would have thought that no one would have overcome. And so then this was a further example of our desires and ability to push forward on our ability to be successful in the face of adversity.
Julian, whether or not he had truly meant what he said in his challenge to Goering, seems to have been inspired by the response because he ventured up to Canada, returning to the country for the first time since his departure in the 1920s, determined to enlist in the Royal Canadian Air Force as a foreign volunteer, ready to take on his Nazi nemesis should the issued challenge be met.
Dispatches from an airport in Canada revealed that the colonel had passed his physical examination and would take his flying test for service in the Royal Air Force. Alas and alack, dispatches the following day were to the effect that Colonel Julian's career as an RAF pilot was short-lived. Not only was the examiner afraid of the colonel's flying ability, but he also was very much afraid that if the colonel did any flying in the RAF, he would have to buy his own plane because the British could not afford to have any planes cracked up because of a pilot's inability to fly. Ludlow W. Werner, The New York Age.
At age 43, Julian refused to admit that he could not handle the precision demanded of a wartime aviator. He blamed bad weather conditions and his unfamiliarity with the twin-engine Hudson trainer he had been asked to perform his examination in.
We could have actually had a black American pilot fighting in World War II before the Tuskegee Airmen, so it would have been a pretty remarkable story. But the fact that he kept at it for all those years and tried to get back into and help out in military aviation in the United States and our cause in World War II is pretty remarkable that he just at that age, into his early 40s, was still at it.
In order to prove his naysayers wrong, the Black Eagle called for a press conference at Floyd Bennett Airport in Brooklyn, taking off in a two-seater monoplane he had rented for the occasion with reporter Robert Smith as his passenger. After leveling the plane at 2,000 feet, Julian performed loops, rolls, and dives for 25 minutes before touching back down. He stepped out of the cockpit and said, "Now I showed you. What more can I do?"
My father's body was ravaged from injuries due to his numerous crashes and other misadventures. My father never felt immortal, but he knew that he still had a lot more to give and a lot more years to live. This was just a turning point. The door to his military aviation career closed, and it just opened up to other avenues because it was on to the next mission, on to the next adventure, like any great adventure.
While no response ever came from Goering, Julian did not let the challenge die a quick death. He continued into 1941 to let it be known that he would be ready for anything.
If Goering sends a whole fleet of planes to get me instead of coming alone, which I anticipate he will do, that will be that. I am ready. It will be a pleasure to die amidst bomb and shell just to show what dirty rats the Nazis are.
Julian started 1941 in heroic fashion. A fire had blazed through a 10-family tenement one night in early February not far from his home. Before the fire department could arrive, the Black Eagle rushed indoors, pulling 16-year-old Virginia Bush, a victim of infantile paralysis, from the inferno. But the rest of the year would not feel so rewarding. In August, Essie filed papers for divorce, citing her husband as being unfaithful, going so far as to name one Dr. Mary Jane Watkins as his mistress. Julian, never one to shy away from publicity, begged the press to remain out of his private life. It is unclear if what Essie accused him of was true. However, given his public persona and the amount of time he spent away from home, Julian probably had been, at one time or another, unfaithful to his wife. How serious Essie was in pushing for a divorce is not known, nor is it known how far the proceedings got, because the two remained together despite this bump. It may have had something to do with what happened before the end of the year.
Japan attacked the United States today, striking by air at the great Pearl Harbor Naval Base at Honolulu, ignoring President Roosevelt's personal last-hour appeal for peace to Emperor Hirohito last night. The war that Adolf Hitler started exploded into a world conflict today. The Spokesman Review.
Following the tragic events of December 7, 1941, Julian took to the press declaring, "If the Japs could use surprise attacks, so can we." He began rallying black youths in New York to join the armed forces with the intention of creating, as Julian described it, a suicide squadron, trained in parachuting, marksmanship, and gunnery. The response in Harlem was overwhelming when, within days of his issuing the call, over 200 men enlisted, being examined by one Dr. Pettioni. On July 3rd, the United States Army gained one Black Eagle into its ranks. At the age of 44, Hubert Fauntleroy Julian had enlisted as a buck private, waived his 2-week pre-induction furlough, and was sent to Long Island's Camp Upton for basic training.
Had Julian given as much time to developing his skill as an aviator as he gave to seeking publicity, he would now be of great value to the Air Force. He had foreflushed so much that when the war came, he had to make some attempt to justify his claims as an aviator. That his challenge to meet Hermann Goering in a duel above the English Channel was all bluster is now evident. His is a classical example that the days of fourflushers are over, at least for the duration of the war. We must all do more work and talk less. Braggart's cut a sorry figure in this war. The New York Age.
I think there's still a sense of the unfortunate ideas of divide and conquer that may have played into why the press might not have genuinely believed that he was someone who could have brought anything great to the table.
Julian's patriotism for the country he had called home most of his life notwithstanding, it is clear that his intentions to serve, while admirable, possessed an ulterior motive. A law had been put into place that any alien serving for 90 days and having a record of good conduct would be eligible for American citizenship. On the way to his next post in Bangor, Maine, the Black Eagle of Harlem stopped in Boston and in full uniform took the oath of allegiance, becoming an American on September 28, 1942.
My father just wanted to serve his country. He still wanted to be active. He still wanted to be in the mix, so to speak. If citizenship came out of it, then so be it. But that wasn't his primary reason.
On short leave from his guard duties for the 38th Aviation Squadron, Julian traveled to New York on a goodwill mission.
I have a very important assignment for the boys from New York City who are stationed with me. And I'm going to need the help of all the folks back here who have the interest of our boys at heart. There are hundreds of boys from here, up there, who are stationed so far from centers of recreation that it is impossible for them to have any relaxation, especially since the deep snows make traveling almost impossible. Now, they have no recreation facilities, and my mission here is to rectify the situation. And I do sincerely hope its results will make the boys back there happy.
After successfully collecting donations of recreational paraphernalia, Julian headed north again. Reports came out a month later that he was being sent to the United States Technical Air College in Lincoln, Nebraska, where he would be taking a 13-week-long course in order to become an instructor. This, along with the long-held story that he was a part of, if ever so briefly, the Tuskegee Airmen, has no basis in fact. It is clear that misinformation, possibly straight from Julian himself, was being fed to the newspapers. If he was, in fact, brought down to Nebraska and Alabama, they were short excursions which produced nothing worth mentioning, for he himself never uttered anything substantial concerning either place. His final military check for $84.75 was drawn on May 17, 1943. His honorable discharge, listing his age as the reason, along with his specialty marked guard and his character as excellent, came shortly after. In the end, Private First Class Hubert F. Julian had served under a year in the armed forces of the United States. He would not, however, go back to New York just yet. After sending out several applications, Julian was hired by the Ford Motor Company as an assistant to their Director of Employer-Employee Relations at the Willow Run plant.
There is absolutely no Jim Crowism at Willow Run, and I am convinced that the Ford plant is the most democratic business organization in Detroit. A few weeks ago, they fired a Southerner for insulting a Negro. They refuse to tolerate that sort of stuff. Negro workers are doing their share, something we can all shout about. There's a young Negro woman on the job who handles a crane better than any man I've ever seen. I'd certainly like to see our papers print some stories like that, because it would do a world of good.
With the war in Europe coming to a close in the spring of 1945, Julian, having returned to the East Coast sometime beforehand, took up a cause alongside James Pemberton, head of the League for the Promotion of Equal Opportunities in Sporting Amusement, calling upon Ford Frick and William Harridge, presidents of the National and American Leagues of Major League Baseball, to end the nearly half-century-old color line, barring persons considered non-white from playing.
You, Presidents Frick and Harridge, are herewith advised that on the opening day of your league that we, the Negro veterans of World War II and businessmen of New York will boycott your games. Your failure to employ competent Negro players motivates this action. Baseball is the great American sport. Black Americans contribute hundreds of thousands of dollars annually to its support, yet we are denied the opportunity that is rightfully ours to participate as players in the game. Our sacrifices in this and other wars in the defense of our country for democracy's cause entitles us to equal opportunity in all phases of American democratic endeavor. Your discriminatory practices are alien, undemocratic, and wholly at variance with the democracy for which we fight. James Pemberton.
After a Julian-led picketing protest outside the Polo Grounds, home to the then New York Giants, it was reported that Congressman Vito Marcantonio, an Italian-American Republican from New York who had a consistent record of advocating for the rights of African Americans, introduced a resolution to the House of Representatives calling for an investigation into the practices of Major League Baseball where the color line was concerned. The role played by Pemberton, along with Julian's help, cannot be overlooked. That year, Branch Rickey, general manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers, held tryouts for black ballplayers, ultimately signing Jackie Robinson in November, who in 1947 would become the first person of color to play in Major League Baseball in the 20th century.
And this is something Julian would have loved people to believe, that he led this protest and then baseball gets integrated. I think what's more accurate and very admirable is that he knows which way the winds are blowing and what's important to people in the black community. And so he inserts himself in that. And I'm sure he felt very strongly, rightly so, that baseball should be integrated. But the issues don't pass him by. He knows what's going on and what people are talking about and what's important. And these are the things that he gets involved with.
1945, the celebrated year in which World War II came to an end, would not conclude well for Julian. An incident involving a veteran and a police officer would land the Black Eagle with a splitting headache and a night in jail.
Just in front of me, at a Harlem subway station, a colored soldier, slightly drunk, went up to buy a 50-cent token at the cash kiosk. The white man inside started abusing the soldier for not pushing his money far enough over the desk, and the GI began to reply in the same way. I went up to the kiosk, bought his token for him, escorted him to the barrier, and gave him $1 to send him on his way. Then I went back to tell the man what I thought of him. Quite an argument developed, and when it was at its most heated, a subway cop came along. I began to explain what had happened, but the officer would not listen, and suddenly raised his club to me.
Patrolman Raphael Jacobson whacked the Black Eagle across the skull and hauled him away. Magistrate Anna Cross reduced Julian's bail from $500 to $25 upon hearing his account of what happened. Later that week, in front of a new judge, Julian's attorney went to battle against Jacobson's, producing several eyewitnesses to the incident in question and bringing to light the patrolman's previous suspension over using excessive force upon a woman a year prior. Julian was acquitted. In the background of these events, Julian had begun forming the Black Eagle Airline with his own funds, and that from his parents' estate, Henry and Lily having passed away during the war. The goal of this venture was to bring supplies in the form of medicine and electronic components to various locations in South America. Due to heavy delays because of the war, Julian would make a significant amount of money, as well as acquire several key contacts who would help spur him towards a new career path. But in the interim, the two planes and pilots he purchased and hired provided him with a very steady income. One of those key contacts turned out to be Major General Harry H. Vaughn, military aide to President Harry S. Truman. Having been approached with an idea by Helmut Eisenberg, vice president of the Frawley Eastern Corporation, Julian told Vaughn of the $11 million worth of old cigarettes in storage throughout the American zone of now military-occupied Germany. The plan Eisenberg had concocted would involve the old cigarettes to be purchased, repackaged, and sold at a profit to vendors in the Far East. Julian's cut would be 5%. Vaughn thought the idea a good one, based on the fact that the government could recoup some of its losses, but had two reservations: that no repackaged cigarettes be sold in American zones, and that they bear pro-Western propaganda rather than brand labels. In July 1948, Julian was off to Europe, but the official story was that he had been appointed by the Truman administration to inspect the conditions and morale of the black soldiers stationed overseas. He would also have to deal with getting approval from General Lucius Clay, military governor of the U.S. occupation zone in Germany.
After talking to Negro soldiers in Frankfurt and Berlin, Julian said that, contrary to rumors in the U.S. that Negro troops are dissatisfied, he had not met one who was not content or who did not get along with the white soldiers. Commenting on the Berlin crisis, Julian, who was traveling as a private citizen, said, "I am an American and I am very proud of my country. We want peace, but if anyone wants to start anything, I'll be glad to come over here and shovel coal, drop a bomb, or whatever is necessary." Stars and Stripes.
Ultimately, General Clay would not approve of the cigarette deal, claiming that his Quartermaster Corps people had determined the so-called stale cartons to in fact still be considered fresh. It would be Conrad Clark who broke the story for the New York Age, exposing Julian and Vaughn by name. The Black Eagle simply shrugged the whole thing off, claiming he had not used government funds to travel to Germany, nor was his business venture anywhere close to being illegal. When further pressed for a comment, Clark was told by Essie that her husband was not stateside. Indeed, he was not even in the Western Hemisphere. The Black Eagle had been sent to Indonesia at the behest of a friend in the Dutch government on a fact-finding mission, and purely, as Julian would put it, because I was a colored man. The idea of sending me was that a Negro would be able to move about more freely.
He associated with people on both sides of the issue, white and black. He wasn't feared as an uppity Negro or an upstarter or someone trying to buck the system. He understood the system. He knew exactly his limitations, but he still tried to extend those limitations. He pushed the envelope as far as any man could at the time.
Indonesia's people had been formerly fighting for independence from the Netherlands since Sukarno, the movement's leader, declared his country's sovereignty on August 17, 1945. When Julian arrived, the rebel leader had just recently been taken prisoner.
Sukarno pointed out that Indonesia was a backward country. His attitude was that it was only the demands of those like himself, the educated elite, which should be considered. He seemed to think he had a divine right to lead his people to independence, and that their wishes did not enter into it. When I returned to Holland with my report, I had several interviews at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where my proposals received very close study. As events turned out, Sukarno got his way, and to my mind has been just as high-handed and arrogant in all his international dealings as he showed himself to be when I saw him.
When he returned to New York in early 1949, Julian spoke of the plight of the Indonesian people, claiming many wished to remain under Dutch control, not holding with the ideology of the revolutionaries. He also claimed to have shot and killed a tiger, as well as showed off a picture of him feeding a parrot. Such were the ways of the Black Eagle. However, and most importantly, Julian realized that there was an emerging market in developing nations for hardware of the militaristic kind, and these new governments were willing to pay more than the goods were worth. He formed Black Eagle Associates and went to Washington, D.C., speaking with Vaughn and other contacts he had down there. In March 1949, Julian had registered with the State Department as a munitions dealer.
Street fighting flared through Guatemala City early today when loyal government troops and tanks fought off an attempt to seize the capital by Revolutionary Army artillery forces. The government of President Juan José Arevalo appeared to be in control of the situation, but a group of 3 loyal political parties issued a statement saying the government is in serious danger. The revolution broke out after the assassination of Colonel Francisco Arana, chief of the armed forces, and Colonel Jorge Barrios Solares, Secretary of the Army. Both officers were shot to death. The Pittsburgh Press, July 19, 1949.
The history of Guatemala in the first half of the 20th century is a convoluted one involving dictatorship, revolution, and foreign intervention. But for the purpose of understanding what led to one Colonel Hubert Fauntleroy Julian's involvement, one needs to understand that once Arana and Solares were dead, it led the way for Colonel Jacobo Arbenz, the Minister of National Defense, to run against Arevalo in the November 1950 elections, winning the presidency. Arbenz, nicknamed the Big Blonde for his paternal Swiss-German origins, had evidently been utilizing the services of Julian because when the latter turned up back in New York in January 1951, it was reported that he possessed a contract for $1 million with the Guatemalan government for the purchase of airplanes and airplane engines. Colonel Eduardo Wayman of the Guatemalan embassy noted that the Black Eagle had spent the prior 10 months negotiating the procurement of surplus war materials. The items obtained then sold to Guatemala by Julian were clothes, medical supplies, jeeps, and firearms of various makes and models, as well as the ammunition to go along with them, which in the end made him a very rich man. The boots alone were an indication of just how well off he was becoming. When an order for 4,800 pairs of boots came to him, he found a New York-based company that wanted $2 a pair. After handing over the $9,600, he turned around and sold them to the Guatemalans for $20,244.
Spotlight was on him from day one once he got that license. So anything he did or said that crossed anyone, it was going to be fireworks. Because here you have a black man traveling the world, selling arms and armament to whoever. He had a blank check to do whatever he wanted to do. It wasn't supposed to happen, and a lot of people felt that it shouldn't have happened, but it did.
Arbenz' series of land reforms, specifically Decree 900, which passed through the National Assembly June 17, 1952, called for the transferal of uncultivated land from large, wealthy individuals and companies to poverty-stricken laborers. This ran afoul of the United Fruit Company, whose banana production in Guatemala accounted for more than 1/4 of all of its assets in Latin America. The American-owned company was among those guilty of leaving large tracts of land to go unused, as well as discouraging the government's past desire to build highways, as it would eat into their monopoly of the railroads also under its ownership. So Arbenz' construction of the Atlantic Highway brought the UFC owners more heart palpitations.
When I first started supplying goods to Guatemala, the government there was being warmly supported by the American administration. United States Army officers had been sent to the country as instructors to the Guatemalan forces. And when I made the first shipment of jeeps direct from the States, there was no difficulty at all about getting an export license. Then the American attitude began to change. CIA reports from Guatemala said that the government there was becoming communist-dominated. So the American administration promptly withdrew its support, and it landed me in real trouble.
In September 1952, a U.S. State Department agent paid Julian a visit at his Harlem office. The government had heard rumors of Guatemala asking their arms dealer to find heavy anti-aircraft weaponry and could not support such an order. Julian was told off the record that the United States would not fill such an order nor allow one to be transferred through its borders.
Here you have someone who's traveled the world now, right? And he probably is emboldened at this point to think that, why should I be afraid? That type of tenacity is a great lesson, I think, for people, that you have to be willing to face opposition, willing to face conflict and challenge and adversity. And it's not always easy. Even in the face of the U.S. government, it's not easy. But sometimes you have to stand on that which is right.
Julian, however, paid little mind to what had been said to him. Instead, in Black Eagle style, he contacted the Swiss government and purchased 12 Oerlikon 20mm anti-aircraft and anti-tank guns. The profit, once the Swiss equipment made it to Guatemala, never seeing itself in U.S. territories, was his motivation. The guns cost $1,500 apiece, and Arbenz was willing to pay $4,000 for each. When he arrived back in Guatemala City to ensure delivery and payment, he found that his contract was being terminated. Arbenz was angrily displeased with his arms dealer's lack of restraint in keeping the doings of his government under wraps. Julian had talked about the Oerlikons to the press, and in a display of how much income the Guatemalans were providing him, purchased a $28,000 Rolls-Royce. Arbenz dismissed him and sent him to the airport.
One day, I will fly back to Guatemala in a jet plane at 600 miles per hour. My friends had better paint their roofs as identification against the bombing and revenge of the Black Eagle.
Thanks to the heavy pressure from the United Fruit Company, the administration of President Dwight D. Eisenhower had sent the CIA down into Latin America to begin arming, funding, and training an army led by Carlos Castillo Armas, a former Guatemalan military officer living in exile after escaping imprisonment at the hands of the Arbenz government. While this was going on, it was discovered that while the Oerlikons were operational, there was no ammunition included in the shipment. A furious Arbenz recalled Julian, hiring him back under the condition that this time he keep his mouth shut. The Black Eagle went to work, knowing that if he did not meet the demand from his client in an acceptable amount of time, there would be no more contracts, no more deals, and most importantly, no more income. The CIA-backed Operation PB Success was launched in August 1953 against the Arbenz government of Guatemala. Julian, feeling an amount of pressure he had yet to experience in his few years as an arms dealer, hastily and rather foolishly put out $40,000 of his own money in order to secure the purchase of 25,000 rounds of ammunition from a company based in Italy. What he did not plan on was the Norwegian freighter carrying the shipment to stop in New York Harbor.
Customs officials seized the shipment and transferred it to the U.S. Navy arsenal at Leonardo, New Jersey. Although the United Nations does not have an embargo concerning shipment of arms in Guatemala, it is known that the Central American nation is playing the communist game. According to customs officials, Mr. Julian did not apply for the necessary import license for shipment of the ammunition as required under the 1939 Neutrality Act. While government officials deny that there are no political factors involved in the business jam, sources said that there was a possibility that some officials may resent the fact that a Negro is representing a foreign government in its business dealings. The New York Amsterdam News.
Financially crushed, Julian sat back and watched as Poland supplied Arbenz with the weaponry he desperately needed. Despite constant remarks that he had nothing to do with the deal, Julian's recent series of exploits were marks against him. He was seized while in Paris on June 14, 1954, a month after the Polish shipment had made it to Arbenz and taken to the American embassy, where he was made to sign an affidavit swearing to never again support countries considered unfriendly to the United States. 3 days later, he was picked up at New York International Airport and had his passport seized by federal authorities. It would take a month and long, heated talks with State Department officials to obtain a new one.
Anyone who's a private arms dealer is probably going to have the attention of the authorities, but I think a lot of it had to do with his race as well. He certainly uses the narrative to whatever end suits him, which muddles it for the rest of us. But I do think there's a big difference between selling military surplus and being an arms dealer.
As all of this was transpiring, Armas's forces had disposed of Arbenz, who fled into exile, ultimately dying in 1971 of an apparent drowning in his bathroom in Mexico City. Armas would become president of Guatemala on September 1, 1954, and serve until his assassination on July 26, 1957. A series of other American-backed dictators would follow in his stead.
Only a sucker would buy arms from behind the Iron Curtain, sight unseen. Guatemala did just that, and they lost the war. For the big shipment of arms they got from Poland, cash on the nail just before the balloon went up, turned out to be duds. A lot of old rusted junk. At my rate, which is 30%, I could have cleared $3 million on the deal. Sure, I'm in the arms business, and I was doing all right until Washington gave me the works. Whoever runs Guatemala now owes me 100,000 berries, and I don't mean bananas.
When Julian returned home from England in August, he walked off the ocean liner wearing a gag, mumbling a good day to the reporters, and stormed off. No explanation was given as to the reasons for this act, but it might have had something to do with Julian recognizing a serious need to quiet down his boasting to the newspapers. He would not take up his new profession again for nearly 2 years until events in the Caribbean turned favorable for him.
It was at dawn on July 26, 1953, that Fidel Castro led his first rebel band. He brought them to the walls of President Fulgencio Batista's Moncada barracks and fired a shot. When the battle was over, the rebels were in prison, sent to the Isle of Pines to serve 15 years. The 26th of July is hardly a heroic day. It is a day of immaturity. The sun has not yet set on it. Batista made a mistake. He freed all political prisoners. Fidel Castro might have gone home to his wife and his son and hung out a new shingle, but he didn't. Jim Bishop, The Sunday Independent.
Hubert Julian had been looking for where the next phase of his career would take him. When word reached him that Castro and his brother Raul had teamed up with the Argentine Ernesto Che Guevara, a revolutionary he had been briefly made aware of during his stint with Guatemala in June 1955, Julian knew what he needed to do. In August, he flew to Havana. Batista had once been the publicly elected president of Cuba before seizing power in 1952, establishing a dictatorship which the United States recognized as a legitimate government. But with the news of the exiled Castro regrouping his forces, Julian set up a meeting with several agents in the Cuban Defense Ministry, explaining that his services were available and that he could get for them what they needed from the United States, but faster. Perhaps, he hinted, even equipment the Americans were unwilling to provide. His impromptu meeting over, he left.
He was really backing anybody who could purchase whatever he could get his hands on, but this was his source of income, kept him in the news. You have to give him credit. He stayed on the periphery of world events for half a century.
More than 100 persons are believed to have perished, and thousands were left homeless by Hurricane Janet's furious winds last night and today. Inland communications are knocked out, and officials said it was impossible accurately to estimate the number of casualties. The hurricane smashed across Barbados Island, flattening flimsy wooden structures in which the poorer of the island's 200,000 inhabitants live. Shattered buildings and fallen trees blocked the main highways. The Spokane Daily Chronicle, September 23, 1955.
At its worst, Hurricane Janet's Category 5 winds reached a maximum of 175 miles per hour. Over 1,000 deaths were reported across the Caribbean and Mexico, where it ultimately dissipated. Damages amounted to an estimated $65.8 million. Julian put aside his arms-dealing ventures to provide humanitarian aid. He purchased clothes, blankets, and medical supplies, shipping them off to the devastated areas. To Grenada, he sent 2 Cadillac ambulances and 2 hearses. George Solomon of the Registrar's Office wrote to him in a letter that said, "I can assure you, Colonel, that I vouch for the sentiments of each and every Grenadian in saying that never in the annals of West Indian history do we find that any one man has done so much for our people."
And this just shows the duality of his nature. He can be different people at different times to different causes, but he was still him. Everything came out of the goodness of his heart for no ulterior motives. Not the spotlight, good press, bad press. He did what needed to be done, and that's what he should be remembered for.
Up in the Sierra Maestra Mountains, where Castro has been holed up these many months, he had perhaps a few hundred men at most. Surrounding them on all sides are 10,000 government troops. The rebels lacked arms and food. They are torn by dissension and demoralization. Worst of all, they have lost the local countryside. Dictator Fulgencio Batista, on the other hand, is more firmly in the saddle than ever. He has beaten back every rebel attack. The truth is, Castro was a sawdust hero. He was nothing but an adventurer who had no political program, no serious military organization, and no mass movement behind him. Daniel James, The St. Petersburg Independent, May 11th, 1958.
James, considered an expert on Latin American affairs, wrote those words when Castro, who had returned to Cuba for another attempt at sparking revolution on December 2, 1956, appeared to be at the end of his rope. What James could not anticipate was the utter collapse of Batista's forces once the United States cut off all arms shipping to Cuba. The guerrilla warfare being practiced by Castro's forces began to hack away at the now unable to resupply themselves forces of Batista's government, which, out of desperation, made contact with the Black Eagle. Julian, ignoring what he had promised the American government after Guatemala, accepted the contract. Learning, finally, to keep his doings under wraps, he made no statements to the press about the deal. In fact, the year 1958 did not feature much on Julian's life, save for one incident right around the time Batista's agents started doing business with him.
On the morning of April 22nd, the colonel reports that he was apprehended in his hotel suites by Haitian police, who advised him to take the next plane out of Haiti. He said that they pretended an astounding ignorance of the reason for his presence there and questioned him at length in a manner which suggested that they suspected the possibility of his connection with revolutionary influences. He was hustled aboard a U.S.-bound plane that afternoon. The New York Age.
While Julian would later claim that this misunderstanding stemmed from his having once spoken with 4 Haitian radicals opposed to President Francois Papadoc Duvalier in New York, his ousting from the country had more to do with his Cuban contract and Rafael Trujillo, dictator of the Dominican Republic. Trujillo had been supporting Batista with money, men, and weapons once he identified Castro as a legitimate threat. Julian, working off of this and wishing to not raise the eyebrow of anyone in Washington, D.C., began shipping all orders to the Dominican Republic, who, in turn, would send on to Cuba. This went on for the better part of 1958.
I do think he was some type of CIA operative. This was the 1950s, and he was trading arms left and right, and there's no kind of way you could have done that and not CIA not known about it. They would have taken you out. You would have never kept your license.
In late December, Julian, along with one of Trujillo's munitions coordinators, went to Geneva in order to buy 150, 30, and 50 caliber machine guns. On the eve of the shipment, however, the Dominican disappeared. Julian, confused and angered, began preparing to have the crated weapons sent directly to Havana. They never made it out of Switzerland.
Batista said he was giving up the presidency to save the country from further bloodshed. His decision came after the 4 days of heavy and apparently inconclusive fighting at Santa Clara. Batista and his party took off for Ciudad Trujillo, capital of the Dominican Republic, in a DC-3 presidential plane about 3:30 a.m. It is estimated that rebel leader Fidel Castro has 5,000 partisans in Havana, many of them well-armed. The Lawrence Journal World, January 1st, 1959.
This was by no means the end of Julian's Cuban story. Indeed, it is the prelude to a more dangerous one for the Black Eagle. When 1959 ended and it was clear that Castro's forces were in complete control of the country, Julian visited the Cuban ambassador to the United Kingdom, Sergio Rojas Santamaria. 6 months prior, Santamaria had accused his visitor of selling to Trujillo, which was of course denied with somewhat of a half-truth, as Julian technically was selling to Batista, using the Dominican Republic's leader as a middleman. The two spoke about 10 North American single-engine jet trainers which Julian promised could be Castro's for immediate delivery. By January 6, 1960, after 3 days of negotiating with the high-ranking military officer Sergio del Valle Jimenez in Havana, a deal for the 10 planes was struck. Julian stood to make $30,000 in profits from it. But when he went abroad to secure the shipment, a cable came in on February 15th saying everything was off. Julian, furious for having his time wasted, flew to New York, picked up his friend John Craker, who was fluent in Spanish, and traveled down to Cuba.
Julian was one of these figures, almost a Zelig kind of figure, who was there at these important key moments. He's one of those figures who is important for not so much what he did, but where he was and the impressions that he made.
They went straight to Jimenez's office, and through Craker translating, Julian was told that the Cuban government had reason to believe that Ambassador Santamaria's earlier accusations were in fact true. After Julian protested, he was told proof was required if business was to resume, or he could run the risk of being labeled a traitor to the revolution. The next day, he produced a sworn statement bearing the seal of the American embassy that he had never sold arms to the Dominicans. Jimenez was pacified, not satisfied. Something did not sit right with him regarding Julian. After making several phone calls, he found a former diplomat from the Batista era who backed up the Black Eagle's testimony. He had not sold anything to Trujillo. He had sold them to Batista. Craker had gone out that night, leaving Julian behind in his hotel. Upon returning, he found his companion, still in his pajamas and silk robe, in the back of a car, surrounded by young soldiers in their green khaki fatigues. He unhappily joined Julian, and the two were driven to a military installation. They were housed in a shed before Julian protested, demanding, at the very least, to remain in the main building. The two would end up sleeping on library benches, feeling the sting from the bruises inflicted upon them by the soldiers as they were moved about. They were allowed coffee the next morning before a sergeant, operating on Jimenez's orders, informed them that they were being deported immediately. It seemed to be in the best interest of the new Cuban government to not jail or send to the firing squad 2 Americans. Within an hour, Julian was on his way back to New York. In 2 years' time, the Black Eagle had been jailed twice, deported twice, and by 2 separate countries, yet managed to avoid long-term consequences. Unfortunately for Julian, the 3rd time would not turn out to be a charm. Flash-in-the-pan skirmishes were over. He was going to learn, the hard way, what it meant to be under the thumb of others. His return to the African continent, indeed his last great adventure, would not turn out the way he had expected.
It was 5 p.m., and the sun's fury was dying. The usual evening crowd sat at the pavement tables of the Palace Tavern, peaceful enough and at the same time sinister because no one was talking. Instead, they gazed fixedly across the street at the gray post office with its clock stopped at 6:53. The building's windows were gone, shattered by the same bullets that stopped the clock. In their place were sandbag emplacements. Through chinks in the sandbags poked the snouts of machine guns, and behind them peered the unwavering eyes of lithe Gurkha soldiers. Hatred smothered the scene. This was Elizabethville in the ceasefire of late September 1961, and at once you could see that war would soon be back. Colin Frost, the Tuscaloosa News.
At the heart of the Congo crisis were the copper, manganese, and cobalt deposits in the Katanga province. Once the Belgians declared their former colony independent, chaos ensued. The army mutinied, and the new Prime Minister, Patrice Lumumba, began talks regarding an alliance with the Soviet bloc. For Moise Tshombe, declaring independence was his attempt to avoid the reach of communism and maintain peace between whites and blacks. The new president employed white officers to run his military, which the United Nations declared unacceptable and moved in to disarm, repatriating a great majority of the several hundred to Belgium. Katanga, it was dictated, could defend itself and would soon have to, as the Congolese invaded shortly after, embarking on a campaign, as several British eyewitnesses reported, of looting and rape. The world was watching with great interest to see what would happen. Many saw it as another Democratic West versus Communist East conflict being played out in a location that should not have had to perform the hosting duties for a proxy war.
Thinking back to Schuyler's serials, one of the things that disturbs the narrator is that there's a report when the Black International defeats the Belgians. There is a wire report that comes in that says, "No Belgians left alive." Schuyler really saw these individual conflicts as part of a much larger situation in which black people being dominated, and even in the wake of the domination, the consequences of that domination would linger for many, many years.
By the time Hubert Julian came onto the scene, Lumumba was dead, executed by Katangi's forces, and U Thant was now in charge of the UN.
Mr. Dalton, president of a firm called the International Broadcasting System, approached me and asked if I would act as a messenger from him to Tshombe, who was at that time staying in Geneva. Dolman thought that as I was colored and also spoke French perfectly, I would be more likely to be successful in getting to Tshombe than himself or any of his executives. Dolman's objective was to get a contract from the president for the making of a documentary film of Katanga to show its prosperity and orderliness compared with the rest of the Congo, to offset the bad publicity President Tshombe's province was getting in America, and to influence businessmen to invest in the country.
Their meeting took place on November 5th, 1961. According to Julian, just before boarding his flight back to the United States, Tshombe, in the backseat of his Lincoln, informed the Black Eagle that he could perhaps be interested with the idea of Julian doing some business for him. Julian would have to wait in order to see what his potential employer had in mind. Nothing ever came of the IBS documentary. Having gone back to America to collect the 10-man film crew, Julian and the group never got farther than Rome. The ceasefire had ended on December 5th, and with the fighting resumed, it was deemed too dangerous to proceed. It would not be until after Christmas when Julian was able to enter into Katanga. He met with Shombe, who made it clear to him that he was not asking for arms and ammunition. Rather, he was asking for the arms dealer's services in finding doctors, nurses, and medical supplies. The two major hospitals in Katanga had been damaged by the recent outburst of fighting. Julian let the president know he would be happy to be of service, but Shombe stressed a point: the medical staff should be non-whites. He was tired of the international community viewing him as a puppet of Belgian neocolonialism. The Black Eagle set out to New York to purchase the supplies, then to the West Indies to recruit the doctors and nurses.
Colonel Hubert F. Julian said he has been named Special Katanga Ambassador at Large. The 65-year-old Julian told United Press International his new job was to break down barriers for President Moise Tshombe's government. Katanga needs friends. I have to help find them. My task is to explain to other countries what we are fighting for, he said. The flamboyantly dressed colonel came to Katanga last November. He soon took up an apartment in Tshombe's palace. His position has never been quite clear. He has been reluctant to disclose his exact relations with Katanga. As leader in the fight against communism, America is fighting for the same goal as Katanga. I hope to get the people there to see our side, he said. The Chicago Defender.
When he was in Martinique, however, it seemed that plans had changed. Word was received from Katanga: buy up an arsenal worth $18 million for a 20% commission. With another ceasefire in place, security, it was thought, would be loosened. Julian dropped what he was doing and did as was instructed. Before leaving Brussels, and much to his later dismay and suffering, he purchased 2 antique pistols and a machine gun, complete with velvet-lined carrying cases. Presents, he would declare in a few days, for Tshombe, and nothing more. On April 19th, 1962, Julian touched down at the Elizabethville airport. He was met upon exiting the plane by a Pakistani UN official who offered him some water, praised his humanitarian efforts, and then informed Julian that his luggage would have to be inspected. The gifts were found, followed by the blowing of the Pakistani's whistle. Finding himself surrounded by military and civilian personnel, he insisted on his innocence as far as those firearms were concerned. When they searched him, however, the Black Eagle had nothing left in his bag of tricks. In his pocket, he had a document detailing the monetary arrangement he had agreed to, and worse, stapled to it was the order: 2 million rounds of ammunition, 200 120mm mortars, 200 60mm mortars, 320 machine guns, and 200,000 rounds of mortar ammunition. The blue-helmeted UN peacekeepers promptly arrested Julian.
Foreign Minister Evariste Kimbe announced today that President Moise Tshombe would leave for Leopoldville May 3rd for further talks with Premier Cyril Adula on unifying the Congo. Before he left for a short tour of the interior of Katanga, Mr. Tshombe announced that Colonel Hubert Julian, known as the Black Eagle of Harlem, had never been Katanga's ambassador at large and had no formal connection with the provincial government. The New York Times.
Julian, abandoned by Tshombe, was flown less than a week after being taken into custody to Leopoldville under armed guard. He was placed in a room inside the unfinished Le Royal, where the United Nations had set up its headquarters. Interrogations began the following day. Each and every single piece of evidence against Julian was gone over ad nauseum. His history as an arms dealer was dissected. The Swedes, who were overseeing the questioning, kept at it for days until Julian began telling them tall tales in an effort just to break the monotonous hours imposed upon him, which included a claim that all weapons believed to be for Katanga were actually meant for insurgents in the Bahamas looking to overthrow Castro.
He was a man of integrity. That's how he lived his life from beginning to end. His word was his word. And no pun intended, it was black and white. What's right is right, what's wrong is wrong. And he wasn't going to give a false statement just to satisfy someone else. He was a Black Eagle. He had an image to uphold. He had his name to represent. And he wasn't going to let anyone muddy that up.
While he was not being starved, Julian was clearly not living on what he was used to. And being older now, his body began exhibiting its wear and tear. On the morning of May 19th, he awoke in the hospital, fatigued and weak. Sometime during the night, he had suffered a heart attack and managed to call out to his jailers before passing out.
I'm just about at my wit's end. Nobody is able to tell me what my husband is charged with, or why he is being detained. These words were told to the Amsterdam News this week by Mrs. Hubert Julian. She has not heard a single word from her husband, and her appeals to officials have resulted in nothing but a curtain of silence and secrecy. Last week, she sent telegrams to officials. I'm interested in his health and legal status, and if he has committed an error, I think I have a right to know, Mrs. Julian said. The White House still had no comment on reports 2 weeks ago that Julian had lodged a protest with President Kennedy, claiming that he is the victim of brutalities inflicted by his captors. James Booker, The New York Amsterdam News.
When U.S. Ambassador Edmund A. Julian learned that Julian was ill, he arranged a meeting with Premier Abdullah, asking him to appeal to the United Nations forces in the Congo to have their prisoner expelled from the country. The main factor in Julian's favor was that no munitions were ever actually delivered. In reality, all they had against him was a piece of paper.
It would have been possibly politically problematic if he had died in the jail overseas. And so therefore, it became a motivation, there was an impetus to intervene.
On August 20th, Julian's release was arranged, and Robert K.A. Gardner of Ghana, the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, visited his room to inform him of the situation.
This is one of the saddest days of my life. When I was an undergraduate, I worshipped you as a hero. Most of my African contemporaries did the same, because you were fighting as a Negro pilot with the forces of the Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia to help maintain the integrity, dignity, and sovereignty of an African state. I meet you in person for the first time today as a mercenary, ready and willing to deliver lethal weapons to persons who care nothing for the lives of Africans and seem determined to enslave us again.
No, Mr. Gardiner, these are hard words. I was misled by Shombe.
You are too much a man of the world and too experienced to be so easily misled. Do you not see in Katanga a betrayal of the faith of abolitionists, philanthropists, and missionaries like Dr. David Livingstone, who believed that legitimate trade and industrial development would put an end to the worst forms of slavery in Africa and the consequences of economic backwardness?
It is a pity. I have been completely misunderstood. I share your sentiments.
The Abdullah government has decided to allow you to be repatriated. When you get back home, tell our people in America and in the Caribbean of our agonizing encounter. I had hoped to be encouraged and inspired by you.
In the end, Joseph Desiré Mobutu would take control of the Congo in a 1965 CIA-backed military coup, declaring himself president, and in 1971 renamed the country Zaire, a name it would bear until 1997 when, in another power shift, it was rechristened the Democratic Republic of the Congo. On August 24, 1962, Colonel Hubert Fauntleroy Julian finally arrived back home in New York City. He had been detained without formal charges for 4 months. When asked about his situation, Julian said that he felt the black men must sit down together. This is an African issue, and Africans must decide their destiny and problems without duress from Europeans.
I think he changed. I think he became much more circumspect about his life, and I think his Black Eagle days were behind him.
The Black Eagle's globe-trotting days of high adventure had seen their climax, and the sun had begun its descent. But his golden years would be lived in classic Julian fashion. One could not expect anything less, of course. There is much to the old saying that you cannot keep a good man down. Even in retirement, Hubert Julian would not settle for a complete stop. He continued to travel, making headlines even when he was not seeking them. On a vacation to Haiti in 1963, the newspapers speculated that he had ventured back to the French-speaking nation to conduct business. He laughed it off, saying, "I'm too old and too rich to start any foolishness." A year later, he made his way back to the Congo after Shombe was elected premier of the Congolese government, making sure to jab once or twice at the United Nations for his being detained 2 years prior. He continued to deny any wrongdoing in the whole affair when he said, "If I had wanted to smuggle guns, the United Nations would not have been smart enough to stop me." He exchanged pleasantries and laughs with the likes of Muhammad Ali, appeared on The Tonight Show and The Merv Griffin Show, and even sat back to watch the Apollo astronauts re-enter the Earth's atmosphere, courtesy of a parachute device that bore striking similarities to the invention that had originally brought him to the United States for the first time. When events abroad or at home occurred, he was not going to start censoring himself. In response to the race riots which broke out in Los Angeles, Julian, controversially, but not wholly unexpectedly, let the world know where he stood.
I will take my family somewhere, to some part of Europe or Africa. As far as living in the United States is concerned, I can't anymore. The conduct of people who look like me leaves me appalled. I am ashamed to be a Negro. This riot is disgraceful. The rioting, raping, and arson does not solve any racial problem. Negroes should be thankful and carry themselves in such a manner as to justify the stand President Lyndon B. Johnson took in spite of the criticism he has received from the Southern Bloc.
Even though he maintained as best he could a separation between his public and private lives, that did not mean Julian's family played second fiddle to his career. When Essie passed away on January 4, 1975, the two had been married for 48 years. Raising Olga Vera Edmonds as their own and enjoying their two grandsons, Anthony and John Jr. But in March of that same year, two individuals would join Julian at his home in the Bronx, a woman named Doreen and son, Mark Anthony Bernard, whose father was none other than the Black Eagle himself. The parents met when Julian had stayed at a hotel in Grenada where Doreen worked as a housekeeper. He took to her when he realized her skills at, oddly enough, ironing his custom-made shirts. She was brought up to the United States to look after the large house the Julians called home. When Doreen became pregnant in late 1970, she was sent to Trinidad, where she gave birth to Mark the following July. Julian did this to avoid a scandal and keep Essie from finding out. Whether she knew or not is not known. But when she died, Julian felt it only proper to be able to know and raise his son. Given his advanced age, he did the best he could.
Hubert Julian was daddy, and he gave me life. I can only thank him, be proud to carry his name, and to bring his story back to life. I miss him in ways that really can't be put into words. He always had a smile on his face. He always had a laugh, a joke, a story. Even at his advanced age, he had a spring in his step. It's almost as if he could step right outside and step back into the newspapers or step into an airplane or make a phone call, make an arms deal. He was the Black Eagle to the end.
The Black Eagle died of natural causes on February 19, 1983. He was buried in Calverton National Cemetery in Long Island, New York. His death went unnoticed by the world for 8 months, causing one writer for the New York Amsterdam News to accuse Doreen, Julian's widow due to their 1977 marriage, of not liking his famous, sometimes infamous reputation. Nearly a quarter of a century later, Doreen would set the record straight.
I had nothing to do with what this writer wrote. Hubert didn't want any reporters swarming the house. He just told me to keep it peaceful. He'd had enough of it all. He didn't leave the house for the last 5 years. There was nothing left to do, nowhere left to go. But he felt very comfortable with his life, and always talked all the time about the things he had done, the people he had met, and all the money he used to make. He gave you so many stories you didn't know how to keep up with it all. His life was like a fairy tale.
How does someone so public, so much larger than life itself, become forgotten? Hubert Julian is not the only victim of this phenomenon. While his name is not fully wiped away from the annals of history, it is not present in the mind of even the average historian. For 40 years, the Black Eagle of Harlem played a role at either the center or periphery of world events. Big or small, he was there. He was as big a part of the 20th century as any one of his contemporaries or counterparts. There were moments of triumph, of failure, but overall, They were definitive in that change, for better or worse, was transpiring.
I think it's important for us to get to a place where we begin to retell the stories of history. Oftentimes those stories are told and we're not involved, right? We don't have any say in what the story is. And so then somebody else is telling the story, and our lack of involvement in the story or our lack of understanding in the story puts a person like him on the shelf. And so his significance might have never been known. And we need a fuller understanding of American history, and I think Julian is one of those case examples.
In looking at his history and his story, it forces us to remember those places, those conflicts, those moments, those milieu where he showed up.
This was the end of the era when you had actual quote-unquote adventurers, people that would go and make discoveries and travel to the ends of the earth when it was much more difficult to do so. He's at the end of this era when simply making that effort to go to Ethiopia or the Congo can pay public relations dividends for him, which isn't really the case anymore. Anyone can go anywhere now. But when he was doing it, it was really an achievement.
Historians have done him an injustice by not digging into his background, much less his exploits, further than they have. And I think in doing so, the history of black aviation as a whole suffers from that.
Aviation was going to change the world, and he was one of the people, maybe not making the great flights, but traveling the country and promoting aviation, and certainly trying to get minorities interested in flying was really a remarkable feat that he should be remembered in a positive way for.
History, for all his good intentions, is political. And if you're not viewed as either on the right or on the left, to be neutral, but still be in the spotlight, you could be forgotten, you could be shelved. It's disappointing to know that his exploits in Harlem are not as widely known as other notable Harlemites at the time. But this is what we're trying to change. We're trying to bring him back into the public eye and let Harlem fall in love with him all over again.
A young Trinidadian from humble beginnings captivated the masses with a bravado the likes of which many had never seen or have experienced since. This showman of international renown summed it all up quite poignantly.
There have been thousands of words written about me over the years. Often the writers treated me as a joke. Others have been sympathetic. Others again have seen me purely as a mercenary, as a merchant of death concerned only to make a fast buck. But all of them have missed the central point of my life, the thing which has been the basic cause of all I have done. And that is that I am a Negro. It is not easy for people to understand just how big an effect this one thing can have. It has often been said that anything I did solely for Hubert Julian. But this is not true. Of course, I was concerned to make money, and of course, I wanted personal fame, but everything I did focused attention on the Negroes. When I first started flying and parachute jumping, that in itself was enough of a novelty to attract notice. It was twice as much of a novelty when a colored man was doing it, and helped to prove, if only in a small way, that Negroes really are as other men are. Show me a man who has never made a mistake or made a fool of himself, and I will show you a man who has done nothing with his life, attempted nothing, and achieved nothing. To a young man of today, I would give this advice. Look at yourself in the mirror and see not a man with black skin or brown or yellow or any other color. See just a man and know that you are just as capable as any other.
At last, it has come to pass. Alas, Lieutenant Julian would fly at last. Lindbergh flew over the sea. Chamberlain flew to Germany. Julian says Paris or eternity. At last, it has come to pass. Alas, Lieutenant Julian would fly at last. Lindbergh flew over the sea. Chamberlain flew to Germany. Julian says Paris or eternity. Negroes everywhere, Negroes in this hemisphere. Come, come in a crowd, come, let us all be proud. When he conquers the waves and air, in his glory we're going to share. He said Paris or eternity. At last, at last, Julian would fly at last, at last, at last. It has come to pass. Lindbergh flew over the sea. Chamberlain flew to Germany. Julian says, Paris or eternity. Let us all show that we have pride. Let us all rally to his side. This is no joke, this is no sport. Let us rally to his support. Whatever be his destiny, we'll be proud of his bravery. He said Paris or eternity.